The story begins in an ordinary apartment, which is located in a huge multi-story building. A guy named Komaba Ritoku, who was 35 years old, was having dinner all alone. On his plate was a large piece of meat with a side dish. Komaba cut off a piece and ate it. He happily said that it was very tasty. He thought that he always liked being alone. His luxurious bachelor life was amazing. The guy looked out the window and thought that he didn't need to argue with anyone and didn't need to compromise all the time. When you're alone, you spend money as you please, you live freely and breathe deeply. Komaba imagined other young men arguing with their girlfriends, while he was just lying on the couch and no one was distracting him. He felt happy. The guy added that this was why he didn't want to get married. Komaba dropped his fork and clutched his heart. He fell, and this cheerful guy would never get up again. He died. Komaba lived alone and died alone. He lived freely. How could he have any regrets? In front of him stood two guys, one dressed in all white, the other in all black. Komaba thought in surprise that he had met people who called themselves gods. One of them said that he had caught the eye of some god of loneliness. The guy in white put his hand on his friend's shoulder and said that the thing was that this guy really liked him and was inviting him into his world. The guy asked in shock that they were offering him to be reborn as another person. He didn't know how to react to such a statement, so he didn't say anything else. He just listened to these strange men. Komaba thought that basically he was offered to be reborn in another world. He was offered to choose any skills. He chose the best skills in order to live alone. The God of Solitude nodded his head as a sign that he approved of the guy's choice. The man in white said that healthy body, rule of any element, fencing, martial arts, and craftsman magician, these 5 should be enough. As he said this, he bent his fingers to make sure he didn't make a mistake with the number of skills. He asked Komaba in surprise that he was sure that he would be satisfied with such ordinary skills. There are much more interesting and powerful skills. Komaba thought that he wondered what it would be like to be reborn in another world. Komaba loudly replied that he was not interested in them. All he wanted in the other world was a graceful bachelor life. The boy thought that he would not give up his point of view. The God of Solitude smiled broadly at the boy's words. He was in a huge bedroom. In the crib lay a small child. It turned out to be Komaba. The boy tried to get up or grab something. He thought that he really was reborn. Komaba continued to reason, which means that those who are now before his eyes are his parents. In front of him, a woman and a man were talking, smiling widely. He was being tied up in the arms of a beautiful girl, and a man in glasses was standing next to him. He looked at them in surprise. The girl was pinching his cheeks and laughing at his reaction. Komaba thought in shock that he was 35, and they were playing with him like a child. She had to stop right now. The girl happily told her husband that the baby was so happy. Komaba thought irritably that it was nothing of the sort. He should have asked God to let his childhood pass. A man took him in his arms. He and the girl looked at the child with a smile. The man began to rock him. Komaba looked at the happy couple and thought that if this continued, he would die from stress. The man sighed in surprise and told the girl that it seemed like the baby needed a diaper change. Komaba was perplexed for a few seconds. He looked at this man and didn't understand what he was going to do now. He was actually already 35 years old in his past life. He screamed loudly when they started touching him. Komaba thought, no, stop, he has to stop. He would rather die than let someone wash and dry him. The man said with a smile that they were going to take it off now. Komaba thought, no, not that. The girl said it was breastfeeding time. Komaba thought hysterically that he would never do that. She said with a smile that they would lift him up now. Komaba screamed that no one should touch him. The baby thought that this was a real hell in which he would have to survive. 8 years later, in the same house, in a huge room filled with books and devices, sat a boy. His father was passing by his room and decided to look in on his son. A man came in and called him Zilk. The boy thought that Zilk Luren was his name, which was given to him in his second life. The man who came to him, lest Luren, was his father. Zilk told his father that he was drawing up plans for a new magical instrument. The boy thought he was reborn in a world where there are monsters and magic, a real fantasy world. There are people who can control the elements, such as fire. Others are good with a sword and defeat the various monsters that exist in this world. There is something similar to household appliances in this world, magic tools. However, in terms of functionality, they are still very far from household appliances. When God told him about this world, he thought that it was possible to create something close to household appliances for a comfortable life. so one of the skills he asked for was craftsman magician. The Luren family is studying magical tools. The God of Solitude must have thrown it here on purpose. The man asked the child with a smile what he had come up with. Zilk showed the drawing and answered his son that he called this magical instrument a refrigerator. By maintaining the temperature inside, food can be stored in it for a long time. Lest stared at his son in surprise. The boy added that food does not keep well in the summer, so it is usually dried or salted to preserve it. He thought that if he could cook fresh food all year round, the number of dishes that could be prepared would increase. The man stared at the drawing in shock and shouted for Mira to come here. Zilk proudly thought that food was the main pleasure in his life. He would like to develop this direction first of all. Zilk thought sadly that he really missed fried chicken and highballs. Mira Luren, Zilk's mother, came in. She looked at the drawing and said that her son had come up with this. Lest adjusted his glasses and said he was worried about the strength and duration of the cold they would receive from the ice magic stone. Zilk looked ahead. Zilk replied that cold air descends. As long as the cold is not too strong, there can be no problems. The parents looked at their son in surprise. Lester's glasses shattered from his shock. Mira smiled and said that it was clear, that's why he attached the stone on top. Zilk thoughtfully said that it would be nice to also be able to freeze food. The drawing still needs to be finalized. Zilk began to add to the drawing. Lest asked what could then use 2 stones at once. Zilk confidently answered that no, the depletion of the magic stone must be taken into account. The boy added that the drawing must be looked at more broadly. Lest grabbed his son's drawing and shouted that he was a genius. Mira said with tears in her eyes that it was amazing, he was a real genius. Zilk was scared by such a loud scream and looked at his parents. Lest shouted loudly that he invented something like that at such a young age. He is a true genius. Mira proudly said that it was his refrigerator. It will surely sell well. The servants were spying on them. They said in surprise and amazement that the young master had invented a new magic tool himself, and he was only 8 years old. He was such a genius that it was scary. One of the girls said that it was a good observation. It was hard to believe that he was really 8 years old. Mira hugged the boy and screamed that he could change this world. Lest happily said that Zilk had a bright future. No, even more. Zilk thought that they should stop choking him. He was having a hard time breathing. Lest stroked his head, and Mira continued to hug him. Lest happily said that, with Zilk, their family had nothing to fear for their future. The boy thought that sometimes it wasn't so annoying. He was left alone in his room. Zilk looked at his notes and said that efficiency is not so easy to improve. He felt that while he is a child, he needs to constantly develop, absorb information, learn a lot of new things. Suddenly, someone called him. A boy and a girl named Art and Ilia Luren ran into the room. The girl screamed that they wanted to play with her brother. Zilk pretended not to notice them. He thought that everything was going according to plan. His quiet life was just around the corner. Ilia pulled him by the vest and screamed, "Brother!" Zilk shouted loudly that she would tear his clothes. Zilk told the girl that he was busy improving the magic instrument. They could play together. Ilia started screaming loudly that she didn't want to, she would play with her brother. Ilia said sadly that he was always like that. He never played with them, he just wrote something all the time and read. Zilk stood up and said okay. Today, he will play with them. Ilia screamed that she wanted to play tag. Art calmly said that he wanted to play hide and seek. Zilk patted his brother on the head and thought that nothing could be done. He would always find time to finalize the drawing. It was the duty of the eldest son to take care of the younger ones. If you think about it, in his past life, he was always upset that because of this he couldn't do what he wanted. Zilk thought sadly that the same thing was happening to him in this life. Ilia joyfully shouted that they were playing tag. He had to count to 10. Zilk shouted after them to stop. They can't run around the house. The boy thought that he would like to become a full-fledged master of making magic instruments as soon as possible. He wants to leave his parents' house already. In the capital, Zilk studies at the academy. He's currently having a training session, a mock fight. He easily defeated his classmate. He doesn't understand how Zilk did it. He decides to attack with fire, since he's good at it. However, the teacher announced that the fight was over. The boy thought that Zilk controlled all the elements equally. How could he use more than 3? The teacher asked him what he didn't want to become a hunter or a knight in the future. Zilk replied that he wasn't interested. The boy sat at the same table with his family. Zilk said loudly that in the future he was going to marry no one. Lest said excitedly that there were so many different girls at the academy. Did he really not like any of them? Lest awkwardly said that he really liked boys. Zilk said that was not the point. He was simply not interested in marriage, that's all. Zilk thought that he didn't need marriage. He realized this in his past life. There is no room for people in his heart. It's much nicer to spend time alone, not tied to anyone, real freedom. He's not going to change anything in this world. Lest awkwardly said that if he didn't get married, he would put them on. Zilk interrupted him by saying that he was not interested. It was not interested. It was not only the eldest son who could inherit the plot. Zilk thanked him for the food and left. Lest excitedly said that maybe he would change his mind when he met someone. Mira awkwardly told her husband that it was true. Time would pass and Zilk would change his mind. He would definitely find a worthy bride. His name is Zilk Luren. He is 28 years old. He still has no plans to get married. Now he lives alone in the capital. He qualified as a master of magical instruments. He opened his own workshop in the capital and makes a living selling the magical instruments he developed himself. Zilk looked at the refrigerator shelf. He thought that it should be made even smaller. The refrigerator, of course, is nice that he managed to reproduce it, but the size is noticeably larger. Zilk thought that the refrigerator had made the Luren family incredibly rich. Besides the refrigerator, he had developed a lot of other things in the last 20 years. He looked at the toaster. Zilk said happily that the toast was ready. He took a bite and said it was delicious. This hot sandwich toaster may sell well. It seems he has made a wonderful magical tool as always. Zilk went outside and looked at the sun. He said joyfully that here was freedom. Zilk thought that family, inheritance problems, constant matchmaking, finally it was all over. He said tiredly that he had endured it all. A girl approached him. She said she could offer him a great option. She was so cute. Zilk said he would refuse. The man shouted at him that he had bought him a new magic tool. As always, it worked great. Zilk thanked him for the praise. The guy thought that it was necessary to continue developing new ones. Zilk continued to reason that if it turns out to create even more comfort. He smiled and said that his life would be perfect. After all, he is a master of magical instruments. And in this world, he will live an elegant bachelor life. Zilk ate in a cafe and thought that he eats what he wants, when he wants what could be better. It is true that fried meat tastes much better when you eat it alone. He was walking down the street and watching people. A man was shouting at them to come and buy. He was offering everyone beef, and another man was shouting that he was selling elephant tuna, which had just been caught today. Zilk thought that in his previous life he lived alone and died alone. Because of his lifestyle, the God of Solitude suggested that he be reborn in another world. He was born into the Luren family, a family of magic toolmakers. Everything was fine until he invented the refrigerator at the age of 8. His father told him that the fate of the Luren family was on his shoulders. As he grew older, people kept trying to get him married, and the noise around him became more and more. His mother angrily asked him when he would bring a beautiful girl into the house. He ignored all this enormous pressure day after day. It had been 28 years since his reincarnation. In those 28 years, he had still not managed to find a bride. Zilk walked down the street with a smile. He thought he had obtained a license as a master of magical instruments and was enjoying his bachelor life in the capital. Zilk stopped in front of a large house. He told himself that he would have to work today. Zilk opened the door and went inside. The young guy who was inside said good morning with a smile. Zilk said without emotion, "Yes, good morning. This guy's name is Tristan. He works in the workshop." The guy looked at Zilk and asked why he was in a bad mood today. Zilk hung up his coat and replied that he didn't seem to be in a good mood, but why did he think so? Tristan smiled broadly and said that Zilka had such a frowning face. A smile suited him much better. He should smile like he did now. Tristan added that then Zilk will become popular. Zilk glared at the worker and picked up his notes. He told Tristan that he didn't need popularity. Zilk added that he was grateful for the concern. Tristan said sullenly that he was so boring. The guy smiled broadly and said that if he were in your place. Tristan thought for a moment and said that he would constantly have fun and meet different girls. Zilk thought angrily that Tristan was so energetic. Zilk sat at his desk and put on his glasses. He asked Tristan if the processing of the ice magic stones was finished. The worker smiled and replied that everything was ready. Zilk looked at Tristan and thought that his job was to process the magic stones. The magic stone is the core of monsters and cannot be used in its original form. Its duties include performing various tasks, such as giving a convenient shape and leveling out unevenness on the surface of the stone. Zilk adjusted his glasses and picked up a small stone. He told his worker that it was beautiful. Zilk pointed at the boxes, which were filled to the brim with stones. He told Tristan to process all these stones. Tristan said tiredly and sadly that he had a lot of work today. A girl entered the room with a wide smile. This girl's name is Rudge. She is a worker. Her task is sales. The girl raised the sheets of paper and with a smile said to the guy that, "Good morning" to both of them. She approached Zilk's desk. Rudge put the paper down on the table with a loud slap. She leaned over to her boss and said loudly that she had brought an order for a new magical instrument. Zilk thought about Rudge. She finds clients and arranges for the delivery of magical tools. She is nice and friendly to everyone. In general, she is responsible for the execution of non-production tasks. Tristan covered his ears with his hands and shouted loudly to the whole office that there was another order. Rudge smiled widely and happily asked if it was bad to have work. Tristan answered the girl incredulously that yes, that was true, but there weren't enough hands for such a volume of work. The guy looked at his boss. Zilk pretended not to hear anything. Rudge folded her arms across her chest and said she agreed. If you think about it, there are only 2 workers. Rudge and Tristan already looked closely at their boss together. Rudge came closer to him and waved her hand in front of his face. She smiled broadly and told Zilk to listen carefully. Refrigerator sales were high. They were clearly making good money. The hero did not want to expand the staff. Zilk replied without emotion that there was no need. Rudge said tiredly and sadly that if there were more workers, then sales would also increase. Rudge added that there were still a lot of people in the world who needed our magic tools. Zilk told his workers that, as he had said hundreds of times before, he was creating magical tools to make his life more comfortable than it was now. Zilk went on to say that he had no desire to work for others. Rudge stepped aside. She put her hand on her forehead and screamed that his outlook on life was not changing at all. Tristan, tired and excited, screamed that he would still like to increase the number of workers. Zilk didn't say anything for a few seconds, but still asked why it was necessary. Rudge stood next to her boss and looked at her colleague with a smile. Tristan grabbed his head and nervously said that if everything continued like this, Tristan jumped up and screamed with tears in his eyes that he would never get a girlfriend. Rudge and Zilk looked at the guy who was screaming loudly without emotion. Tristan continued to shout that Rudge was beautiful, but she was already married. Tristan looked at Zilk and shouted that they had no other girls here, only a gloomy boss. He would not find a girlfriend in such a job. The guy cried harder. Tristan clutched his heart and said with pain that he was almost 19. He wanted love. He wanted to get married. Zilk looked at this tragedy carefully. The boss said that work is not the place for romantic relationships. He then began to list the reasons why marriage was not a good prospect. Tristan started crying and shouted loudly to Rudge that Zilk was telling him nasty things. The girl looked tiredly at Tristan, that in general he was telling the truth, but the meaning was greatly distorted. Rudge asked Zilk that marriage was really that bad. Rudge happily said that it was great to spend time with your loved one. You would enjoy the joys of raising your children together. Zilk introduced the lone wolf and told Ruja that he knows her position is very popular in society, but he prefers to be alone. He does not like to spend time with other people. Zilk added that he does not get along well with children either. The girl started to leave, saying that they had argued about this topic hundreds of times already. There was no point in continuing. Zilk replied that he agreed. Tristan told his boss that this was why he would never marry. Zilk looked at him angrily. The boy shouted at Tristan not to be mistaken. Zilk picked up the magic stone and told his workers that he had no use for it. He was not going to get married. Zilk added that since he wasn't interested, they shouldn't recommend him to anyone. He also didn't want to hear whining about how someone couldn't find a girlfriend. Zilk picked up the papers and told Tristan to get to work. Rudge said tiredly that he was tall, had a huge income, was highly educated, and was attractive. But why is Zilk like this? It was already getting dark outside. Rudge approached him with papers asking if it was time to end the workday. Zilk took off his glasses and replied that that was enough for today. Tristan asked them with a smile if they wanted to go out for a bite to eat together. A new restaurant had recently opened, and they had some interesting and tasty meat dishes on the menu. The guy happily added that there was fried meat there. You had to cook the meat yourself, cut it into thin slices. Rudge thoughtfully said that she knew that restaurant. The girl added that there were always a lot of people there, and it was called. Rudge and Tristan shouted loudly and joyfully together that it was the Maigio fried meat restaurant. Zilk raised his head and looked at the ceiling. He thought that he had not eaten meat for a long time. The guy told his workers that fried meat would be just right. Rudge cried out loudly and sadly that she was asking for forgiveness. She had to go home today. There was no one to look after the child. They had to go to a restaurant without her today. Tristan called out sadly to Rudge that today was the perfect day for a roast. Rudge started to leave, saying that she would like to go, but it was important to spend time with her children. She slammed the door, screaming that she was sorry. They had worked hard today. Tristan looked at the closed door with tears in his eyes. Zilk showed no emotion. Tristan calmed down and told his boss that he wouldn't go either. There was no point in going there with a man. Zilk put on his coat and told the guy that he was right. Zilk adjusted his clothes. Tristan shouted loudly, "Okay, bye then." Zilk said that he would go alone then. The boy passed by people who were spending time with their families and friends. They were talking loudly and laughing. Zilk passed by a table where a young couple was sitting. He thought it smelled delicious. Zilk stopped and looked in surprise at the long line in front of the restaurant. Zilk said that, yes, it was just dinner time. The guy decided to skip the line and went straight to the restaurant. The worker shouted excitedly to him that he was asking for forgiveness. He shouted that the gentleman should get in line. The cook shouted to his worker that he should let him in. The cook left the restaurant and approached Zilk. The cook awkwardly told Zilk that he was asking for his forgiveness. He had recently hired this worker. He was completely green. The cook angrily yelled at the guy to apologize right away. The boy stuttered and asked Zilk for forgiveness. The man said it wasn't necessary. Zilk looked at the crowd and told the cook that it seemed his restaurant was thriving. The cook told Zilk that it was, and it was all thanks to his help. He simply took his advice. He will always be grateful to him for his help from the bottom of his heart. The cook opened the door for the boy, and Zilk walked in. Zilk responded to the cook's praise by saying that he was trying for himself first and foremost. He hoped his place was free. Zilk headed for the table by the window. The cook led him to his place with a joyful smile. Zilk sat down on his chair and put a napkin down so as not to get dirty. You could hear the wood burning. The cook asked Zilk what he wanted today. Zilk smiled smugly and told the cook that he would do it as usual. The cook turned up the heat and shouted that he understood everything. He would do it now. He placed a dish and a drink on the table, saying that it was beef tongue, which was cut into thick slices. The cook went on to explain that he also prepared thin slices of skirt steak and rib meat, all red beef, as well as his drink, called ale. Zilk took special tongs and put the meat on the grill. He said with a smile that this restaurant has the best red beef. The guy began to wait for the meat to cook. When everything was ready, he took it off the grill and dipped it into the sauce. Zilk put the food in his mouth and smiled happily because it was very tasty. He was satisfied with the food. Zilk chewed, thinking that the aging technique, the cutting, the seasonings, everything in Maigyo is on a completely different level compared to other meat restaurants. Zilk put in the next portion of meat. When it was cooked, he began to quickly devour all the food. The guy washed it all down with a huge mug of his drink. He put the mug down on the table with a loud bang and shouted that it was very tasty. Zilk thought he had a sense of satisfaction. He wouldn't have gotten it with the boys. Tristan would have been cooking meat with a big smile and asking him what he wanted to eat. Zilk would answer him that he would have meat from the ribs. Rudge would joyfully shout that she wanted horu manyaki. Tristan would loudly shout at the girl's words that he would like that too. Tristan would start eating the food quickly, without even waiting for it to cool down. The guy would scream loudly that it was hot, and Rudge would excitedly tell him to be careful. Tristan would tell her that it was not his fault. It was all hormoniac. Zilk thought about the situation he would have been in if Tristan and Rudge had come with them. He said that he wouldn't have been able to enjoy the delicious meat then. It was good that he came alone. All the tables in the restaurant were occupied by families or noisy friends. The cook looked at the waitresses, who were talking loudly about something and not working. One of the girls blushed and dreamily said that Mr. Zilk was as cool as ever. Her partner happily shouted that it was her turn to take his order today. The girl shouted in frustration that it wasn't fair. The cook approached them from behind and said in a menacing tone that they should take his order, but only if they tried to pester him. The girls shouted loudly that yes, they understood everything. The cook scratched his head and looked at the girls. He awkwardly said that yes, they argue anyway. The cook looked at Zilk's table and thought that Zilk Luren, this gentleman, was their regular customer and benefactor. His successful restaurant until recently, the cook thought sadly that he was in complete decline. There were no customers. People passed by his restaurant. New restaurants opened one after another in the capital. The chef continued to reason that the competition was just crazy. His restaurant didn't have a chance. There was no income, and the situation was stalemate. But one day, Zilk came to see him. The cook greeted him. Zilk started to say that he had. The guy fell silent, and the cook asked what was going on. Zilk awkwardly replied that he had few customers lately. Zilk asked the chef how the restaurant was holding up at all. The chef was surprised, but still said sadly that no, his old restaurant had not kept up with the new food fashions. Zilk asked him if he needed something that would attract new customers to his meat. The cook answered wearily that it would be nice. Zilk thought about it and started looking at the interior. He saw a sign where the chef gives away meat. Zilk shouted joyfully that he knew exactly what could be done. The cook looked at the guy in surprise and began to listen to the plan. The chef shouted in shock that he wanted the meat cut into thin slices and the customer should fry the meat himself. Zilk said that it was true. That was exactly what he was proposing. The cook thought in horror what kind of nonsense he was proposing. The man calmed down a bit and said that it was understandable when the cook cooked the meat, but it was the first time he had heard of a customer frying his own meat. Zilk said that it was more fun to fry it himself. The cook thought incredulously that Zilk was being serious now. The customer will fry the thinly sliced meat himself, surely they won't complain. The chef thought that, nevertheless, he decided to take a risk. He had nothing to lose anyway, and as a result, this year was very successful. People admired the new way of cooking in the restaurant itself. A couple of friends came to his restaurant. One of them shouted loudly that it was great. His friend awkwardly said that he shouldn't burn the meat there, otherwise they would be left without food. A group of people were sitting at a nearby table and discussing food. One guy said that while you sit and wait, your mouth starts to water. People were eating meat that they had cooked themselves at a tremendous speed. The girl said it was convenient to order meat from different parts of the body. The man said that the spices also went well with the meat. There was even lemon seasoning. Everyone was shouting at the waitresses to bring more. The workers came running to him, shouting that there were too many customers. They couldn't keep up. The cook said tiredly that his head was already boiling. The chef looked at his customers and said that long lines every day and no financial problems were all thanks to Mr. Zilk Luren. Two waitresses approached him. One of them asked the cook why Zilk was always alone. Usually, everyone eats and fries meat together, having fun and chatting with each other. The cook answered the girl that everyone enjoys themselves in their own way. Mr. Zilk likes to be alone. They shouldn't bother him. The girl sadly answered that it was okay. Zilk was finishing his meat at that time. He looked thoughtfully ahead and even stopped eating. He said that now it was time to seriously start looking for rice. Zilk sat in his cubicle, working on new designs. He inserted a quill into the inkwell. He rubbed his forehead tiredly and took off his glasses. Zilk closed his eyes to rest a little. Zilk said he thought he could figure out how to recreate the air conditioner today. The guy looked out the window and thoughtfully said that he hadn't been out into the city for a long time. Zilk came to the Adventurers Guild. It is an organization of people who mainly make a living by defeating monsters. Everyone is divided into groups. They were chatting loudly and laughing. Zilk was dressed in gear. He walked up to the order board. Zilk said that there was an order to collect materials, hunt small monsters. Zilk tore off the sheet of paper on which the assignment was written. He said loudly that it was excellent. Since there were no particularly dangerous monsters, then we could start collecting materials. He stood in line at the assistant's desk. A cute girl yelled for the next one to come. Zilk approached her desk with his errand. The girl smiled broadly and asked the guy what he wanted today. Zilk pointed at the order and said that he wanted to take the order to collect materials. The girl took the sheet in her hands and began to write down his order in the journal. She said with a smile that the order was to collect kilk grass and button mushrooms in the eastern forest. The girl awkwardly asked Zilk that he could join the group. Zilk looked at the three-man team, who were talking loudly about something. The girl added that he was able to rise to B rank on his own. She was sure that in a group he would reach new heights. Zilk smiled broadly and told her that he was asking for forgiveness, but he would refuse. The boy thought that he saw a clear disadvantage in joining with another group. Zilk continued to reason that if he joined a group with his blessing from the God of Solitude, his physical abilities would be greatly weakened. A few years ago, he tried to complete a quest as part of a group. His partner shouted for Zilk to be careful, but it didn't help the guy at all. The mage girl shouted that Zilk was hurt, they had to get out of here. His partner shouted that it was simply impossible. The guy added that Zilk was a real weakling. He was just standing there. Zilk thought that it was believed that people become stronger if they work together, but this did not apply to him at all. Zilk started to walk away from the reception desk, but before leaving, he shouted to the girl that he was not going to raise his rank, and now he could go on a mission. The girl looked after him excitedly and quietly said, "What do you mean? How?" Zilk went into the forest and started looking for the materials he needed to complete the task. He looked at the ground and saw mushroom and grass. Zilk happily thought that it was kilt grass. It eliminates the smell of meat and fish in food, has an antibacterial effect. Zilk began to pick mushrooms and grass. He examined each ingredient carefully. His hands were already full of materials. Zilk picked the last mushrooms and happily said that these were simply excellent. Zilk looked at the materials he had collected and said thoughtfully that this should be enough. He shouted that he would now use his bag. Zilk put the grass and mushrooms in it. Zilk thought it was a magic bag. There was no limit to the number of items that could be put in it. The bag's capacity was much greater than it appeared. Zael continued to reason that such things are called artifacts. They have power that goes beyond human capabilities. For example, a teleportation ring, a flying cloak, and an invisibility robe. The guy added that artifacts are rare treasures that can mostly be found in the dungeon, so they have a very high price. Some adventurers go to the dungeon in the hope of getting rich. Zilk squatted down and began to add more grass that grew near the place where he was. The guy said that in any case, artifacts are strange things. Zilk added that even he, a master of magical instruments, could not understand how they worked. The guy fell silent and then joyfully shouted that there was a mysterious romance in them. He smiled and thought that the artifacts were technologies unknown to people. Zilk was being watched by a boar. The boy did not pay attention to him. He continued to collect grass. Zayok happily said that the artifacts could give them a completely new level of comfort, which they would not get with the help of magical tools. The boy shouted that his heart was fluttering. He loved comfort. Zilk heard a rustling in the bushes. He looked at the boar, who had taken a fighting stance and was preparing to attack. Zilk showed him the mushroom with a smile and asked why he was angry that he had taken his favorite mushrooms. The guy pulled out his sword and said that, come to think of it, he hadn't warmed up in a long time. Zilk got into a fighting stance and said with a smile that this was a great opportunity. The boar quickly ran towards Zilka. The guy was already ready to strike, but the animal ran past him. Zilk looked at the boar in surprise. The guy waited for a blow, but nothing happened. The animal was stuck in a tree and was trying to break free to defeat Zilk. Zilk awkwardly asked the boar about his tusks being stuck in a tree. The guy said disappointedly that it was a warm-up, but he wasn't going to let him go. Zilk dealt with the boar and got the materials from it. The guy sat down on the grass and looked at his prey. He said that now it was time to finish collecting the materials, or maybe go to that place. Zilk walked through the forest. He smiled widely when he noticed the lake, glittering in the sun, and a flock of birds flying nearby. Zilk said that it was always so beautiful here. He said happily that he was alone here. The guy stopped and stared at the man who was sleeping on a sun lounger, and his tent was standing next to him. Zilk looked angrily at the guy and thought that this was bad luck. He carefully walked around him and said that this was not his personal place. Anyone could come here. The guy didn't react at all. Zilk moved even further away from him and angrily said that from this guy's point of view, he could be the one who was superfluous here. Zilk pitched his tent and happily said that it was great, something like that. Zilk laid out eggs, meat, cheese, and nuts on the table. He took out the device and joyfully shouted that it was time to smoke. Zilk thought that he had created a portable smokehouse. Zilk took out a knife and put a piece of meat on the board. He said that first you need to cut everything and put it all out nicely. Zilk cut all the products and put everything on the plate. Zilk set up the smokehouse. He said that it should be lit, turned on, and then inserted into the lid. Everything was ready. The guy began to wait for the food to cook. The guy said with a smile that now he would not die of hunger. Zilk sat down on a chair and took out a book. He looked at the smokehouse and decided that it would be ready soon. Zilk took off his glasses and said that it had been smoking for a long time. The taste should be excellent. The guy removed the lid and smelled the delicious aroma of the cooked food. The boy looked at the food happily. Someone shouted that it looked delicious. Zilk looked angrily at the uninvited guest. The guy looked at Zilk with joyful eyes. Zilk asked who else he was. The guy proudly shouted that he was Eith. Zilk thought tiredly that he was some kind of weirdo again. Zilk covered the plate with a lid with an angry expression. Zilk looked at the neighboring tent and angrily shouted that he was the guy from the neighboring tent. Eith shouted in fear that his look was frightening. The guy decided to explain everything. Eith said it smelled very delicious, so he became curious. Zilk tiredly answered him that that was it. He had satisfied his curiosity. Let him go back to his place. Eith did not let Zilk finish speaking and shouted that he cooked so interestingly, at least it was delicious. Zilk looked at the boy angrily. He said he wouldn't have carried it if it hadn't tasted good. Eith yelled at him to let him try some. Zilk took some skewers out of his bag and thought maybe he'd never eaten smoked meat. He held out a skewer. Zilk told the boy to take a skewer. Let him choose the one he liked best. Eith smiled and speared a small piece of cheese. He sniffed it incredulously. Eith said in surprise that he had never smelled anything like it. It smelled like smoke, but not quite. Eith put the cheese in his mouth and screamed in shock that it was delicious. Eith loudly asked what kind of cheese it was. Was it special somehow? Zilk smiled and answered that no, it was ordinary cheese that he bought at the market in the city center. Eith said thoughtfully that how could ordinary cheese taste so good? It has a unique taste and aroma. It's like it's on a completely different level. Eith looked at the plate and asked Zilk what kind of food it was. Zilk replied that it was smoked meat. It had a great aroma. Eith hesitantly said that it was smoked meat. Eith asked Zykal if the smoke would also give it a refined taste. Zilk took out a bag and said that it was necessary to use carefully selected chips to add flavor. Eith took the bag and asked what kind of chips they were, sawdust or something. Zilk answered that it was true. By the way, it was sawdust from an apple tree. The guy looked at Eith, who tried to sniff it. Zilk angrily took his bag of sawdust from the guy. Eith looked at the other products and asked Zilk what else he could try. Zilk exhaled and told him to bring a plate. He wouldn't let him without it. Eith happily ran to his tent. He came with a plate, a glass, and a bottle of wine. Zilk looked at him in surprise. Eith smiled and said that it was in gratitude for feeding him well. Zilk looked at the bottle and shouted in surprise that it was a wine from Cerberus. The boy thought that it was a rare wine produced in Cerberus, a famous wine region. Zilk added that only a few hundred bottles were supplied from there per year. Eith said with a proud smile that he knew. Let him think that it was a jewel, not wine. Eith asked the boy that they would now drink a little. Zilk raised his glass and said that he would be happy to. Zilk and Eith went to their tents and began to eat. Zilk drank some wine and joyfully shouted that it was very tasty. He popped some smoked meat into his mouth. Zilk closed his eyes and thought happily that the smoked meats and wine were simply wonderful. Zilk looked at the wine in the glass and said with a smile that he didn't think he would get to taste this wine. The guy thought that in his past life, single compers often exchanged what they had. He thought that you give something tasty in exchange for another tasty thing. He always liked it. Eitan loudly shouted that it was delicious, very tasty. Zilk smiled and looked at the lake. He asked himself out loud what he could do fishing after eating. Evening came and Zilk walked through the city towards his home. Zilk said that he would return home now and cook fried fish for dinner. The guy stopped and looked in surprise at the carriage that was parked near his house. He asked what was in front of his house, that someone from his family had been brought there, although, no, the coat of arms was not visible, it was an ordinary carriage. A girl came up to him from behind and shouted loudly that he had finally arrived. Zilk shouted in surprise that it was Ilya. The sister says angrily that he has finally arrived. Zilk was shocked to think that this was an unpleasant surprise. So it was his family's carriage after all. The boy asked his sister Ilya that she had arrived alone. Ilya called the man and answered that of course she was not alone, as if she would be let go. Gillian was with her. The man bowed to Zilk. The guy stared at him in surprise. Zilk thought that Gilliam was the butler and bodyguard of the Luren family. The boy asked his sister why they had come on purpose in a carriage without a coat of arms. Ilya looked at him angrily. She said that if she had arrived in their carriage, he would have run away as soon as he saw her. Zilk turned his head to the side and imagined himself running away from the carriage when he saw her. Zilk asked the girl why they came to him. Ilya screamed loudly, "What do you mean, why? An invitation to a family dinner. The letter must have come to him." Zilk said hesitantly that yes, there was something like that. He told his sister that he would not go. He still had a lot of work. Ilya looked him in the eye and said angrily that no, he would go with her. Zilk started to leave, saying that he would not go. Ilya grabbed his hand and confidently said that he would go. Zilk looked at her angrily and repeated that he would not go. The girl angrily said that she would go. Ilya looked at her brother and said that he had been refusing for a whole year. Mom was worried, and Dad said that she should definitely bring him with her. She promised she would do it, so he had to show his face to the family. Zilk stared at Ilya in surprise and thought that his father had asked her to bring him home. Gilliam worriedly told Zilk that everyone in the mansion was worried about the young master. He asked that Zilk give the family some attention. Zilk made a sad face. Zilk thought in horror that he could not refuse Gilliam. The boy exhaled and grabbed his head. He said okay, he would go, but don't call him young master. Ilya happily said it was a victory. Gilliam smiled and told Zilk that he thanked him. The boy told them that he would go get ready now and then come down to them. Ilya asked him that he did not want to invite them into the house. Zilk angrily answered that he did not. The girl stared at him and angrily asked why. Zilk approached his house. He shouted to his sister that he doesn't let strangers into his house. She sadly said that strangers. Ilya grabbed him by the jacket and shouted that she was actually his sister. Zilk replied that she was his sister, but once she came into his room, she broke his magic tools, so he would not let her in. Ilya looked at her brother in shock. Ilya screamed at the top of her lungs that it was 15 years ago. He had to let her in. Zilk told her not to scream. She would scare all the neighbors. Ilya, Zilk, and Gilliam entered the family mansion. Blessed shouted joyfully that Zilk had finally come. They hadn't seen each other for a whole year. How was he doing? The boy answered his father that only a year had passed. Nothing had changed. Blessed patted his son on the back and headed into the room with everyone. The man happily told Zilk that it was true. He was just like his mother. He hadn't aged at all with the years. Elijah told her father that they would chat at the table. Gilliam opened the door for them. Les told his daughter that it was true. Mira was sitting in the room. She asked Zilk why he had arrived so late. The guy looked at his mother and answered her question. He said that he needed time to prepare. You can't call so unexpectedly. Mira exhaled and said sullenly that the letter for the family dinner was sent in advance. Ilya told Mira with displeasure that her brother had waved her off and didn't want to go, so she had to drag him here by force. The woman looked at her daughter in surprise. Ilya shouted to Mira to listen. She had been driving to him for so long, she was tired from the journey, and he, Zilk, sat with a sad expression on his face. He wanted to leave as soon as possible. A man put his hand on his shoulder and said loudly and joyfully that he was a good man for coming home. The guy thought it was Ludwig, Ilya's husband. Zilk looked at the man in surprise and asked Ludwig that he was here too. Ludwig sat down at the table and smugly replied that it was a family dinner. Obviously he would be here, right? Zilk thought that this guy was the alchemist who used to work with him, and now he was Ilya's husband. Honestly, he didn't think it would turn out like this. Ludwig, with tears in his eyes, asked to introduce him to the girl. Zilk thought that, by the way, when he met him last week, Ludwig told him sadly that he didn't want to go to the family dinner. He told Zilk that last time. Zilk looked at Ludwig and told him to stop. He said he didn't want to. Ludwig hit Zilk's leg with all his might under the table so that no one would see. Zilk made a face full of pain. Ludwig looked at him and asked angrily what he had just wanted to say. He had to learn to read the atmosphere in the room. Zilk angrily asked his interlocutor Nick that he was trying to seem silky in front of his mother. Ludwig tensely answered that, of course, he had to show himself from the best side. Ludwig made a sweet face and called Selah. He asked her if she was happy to see Uncle Zilk. The guy looked at Ludwig and thought he had changed the subject. Zilk looked at the girl and thought it was Selah, Ludwig and Ilya's daughter. The girl sat down at the table with the adults and asked Zilk with interest that he was her uncle. Lest laughed loudly and shouted to his son that he showed up so rarely that Selah had forgotten what he looked like. Ludwig covered his mouth with his hands to hold back his laughter. Zilk turned away from them and looked angrily in the opposite direction. Ilya hugged her daughter by the shoulders and laid her head on top of her head. The girl looked at her uncle with interest. Ilya gloatedly told Zilk to introduce himself at least to his sweet niece. Zilk made an angry face and hissed that his name was Zilk Luren. Selah asked her uncle with interest why he was not married yet. Everyone looked at the little girl in surprise. Ilya gave her daughter a thumbs up. She joyfully shouted that Selah was smart. She asked the right question. Mira looked sadly at her son and said that Zilka was already 28 years old. When would he get married? Zilk clenched his teeth and thought angrily that it had started again. He turned his head away from his sister and said loudly that he was not going to get married. Ilya asked irritably why he did not want to. Zilk confidently replied that he preferred to live alone. He didn't care about marriage. He looked at Elijah and angrily asked how many times he had to repeat this. Ilya thought and asked uncertainly that he could be with the boys. Zilk angrily shouted that he couldn't. The guy thought that he was already tired of this. How many times could he ask? Ilya made a duck face and sadly asked, then, where is his girlfriend? Zilk clenched his teeth in anger and shouted loudly that he doesn't need her. He thought he had already said this 500 times. Mira asked her husband wearily if their son hadn't yet taken a liking to any girl. Lest thoughtfully replied that girls he knew and colleagues often asked him to introduce them to him. Ilya replied that naturally, her brother could well be called a magnet for girls. She thought that Zilka has a higher education, he is tall and handsome. He is single and the eldest son, and also he has a high income. Mira started crying and looked sadly at her son. Zilk turned away so as not to see the looks on his mother and sister's faces. Mira said that she hoped that there would be a girl who could change his views. Mira screamed loudly that she wanted to see his children. Ilya said angrily that if he weren't such a genius at inventing magical instruments, she would consider him a complete fool. Zilk thought wearily that he really wanted to go home. The guy cleared his throat and asked where his brother Art was. Ilya looked at Zilk and replied that Art was at a party and therefore couldn't come. Zilk loudly and angrily asked that Art didn't have to come, but he couldn't. Their gaze indicated that he had asked the wrong question. Mira said that he had not shown up for longer than Art, he had no right not to come. Ilya said that Zilk did not understand anything, that he was forever free only thanks to Art. He seriously did not understand this. Zilk looked at Mira and Ilya in surprise. The girl said that for his sake, Art took on his responsibilities as the eldest son. He entered the upper crust of society. Zilk had already said that he was asking Art for forgiveness. He was very grateful to him. Lest nervously said, "Okay, that's enough, they should eat already." Sayla screamed loudly that she was hungry too. The housekeepers began to set the table. The girls ran around the table with trays and plates. Mira asked Zilk with interest that he ate normally at home. Zilk put down a napkin and answered that he cooked for himself what he liked. Ilya smiled broadly and asked him if he simply bought expensive meat and fried it. She added that he probably washed it all down with expensive wine. Zilk closed his eyes and replied that he did nothing of the sort. Zilk stopped abruptly and looked ahead. He remembered his everyday life and thought that she was absolutely right. He roasts meat on the fire, makes smoked meats. He eats everything he likes. Zilk shouted defeatedly to Ilya that she had hit the bullseye. Ilya excitedly shouted that if he continued to eat like that, he would have no end of health problems. Zilk folded his arms and looked closely at his sister. He whispered that everything was fine, thanks to the blessing of the god of loneliness, he would not get sick. Ilya angrily asked Zilk what he had just mumbled under his breath. Zilk smiled maliciously and told Ilya that he had never been sick in his life. The boy happily thought that all this was thanks to the blessing of the god of loneliness. Mira angrily shouted at her son that his father's words were true. Now he was eating whatever he could, and later it would come back to haunt him. Zilk made a pained face and thought that he really wanted to go home. Sayla's stomach growled and she awkwardly asked what they would eat today. Everyone looked worriedly at the baby, who was now suffering from hunger, and they'd all forgotten about him. Sayla puffed out her cheeks and looked angrily at her mother. Lest guiltily told his granddaughter that he was asking for forgiveness, the adults chatted a bit and forgot about dinner. Ilya smiled and awkwardly told her daughter that she was asking for forgiveness. Zilk looked at the girl and imagined her as an angel who saved him. The boy thought happily that Sayla was a real angel. She could be used. Lest raised his glass and began to make a toast. He said that their family would prosper in the future. The man shouted that everyone drink to the bottom. Everyone clinked their glasses, and Sayla raised her glass of juice. Ludwig looked at his plate in surprise, where there was a piece of fish with a small piece of lemon. The guy awkwardly said that it was an unfamiliar fish. Ilya asked her brother in surprise that he had caught this fish himself. Zilk proudly answered that yes, it was called sabana. The boy thought that today he wanted to eat fish. Lest cried out happily that it looked very good. Ludwig and Lest cut off a piece each and began to chew thoroughly. They simultaneously moaned in surprise. Lest asked his son hesitantly if it was definitely sabana. The man said in surprise that he had eaten it before, but the taste was different from the previous dish made from this fish. Ludwig cut off another piece of fish and said that it tasted different from plain fried fish and had a different aroma. Sayla ate some fish and cried out happily that it was delicious. Ilya looked at her daughter in surprise and said, "Wow, she doesn't like fish." The girl loudly answered her mother that this fish doesn't stink, but on the contrary, it smells delicious. Gallum took out the smoker and said with a smile that it was because he cooked the fish with Mr. Zilk's magic tool. Lest and Ludwig looked closely at the magic tool. Ludwig said that he saw this magic instrument for the first time. Zilk proudly replied that special chips are burned in the magic instrument, and then the fish is smoked. Ludwig picked up the smokehouse and began to examine it carefully. The man adjusted his glasses and told Zilk that he had done something brilliant again. Ludwig moved closer to Zilk and looked him in the eyes. He asked Zilk to sell him one. Zilk stopped eating and stared at the boy in surprise. Lest shouted that he also wanted one of this magical instrument. Zilk saw the eyes of Ludwig and Lest. They were shining with impatience to receive such a magical object. He thought angrily that he would never give them the smokehouse. Zilk thought about it and decided that there would be more problems if he refused. The guy reluctantly said okay, he would make them one copy each. Ludwig and Lest joyfully shouted hooray. Zilk thought tiredly that he really wanted to go home. Zilk sat at his desk and didn't know how to start working. The guy said angrily that there was no progress because of yesterday he was too tired. When he left, Mira shouted after him to come to them more often, everyone would be waiting for him. A tired Tristan came out to him. He said that he was going to have a lunch break now. Zilk looked at the guy and asked in surprise that it was already lunch, but then he would go too. Zilk thought there was something he wanted to try from the cook who was making snacks on the street. The guy sat down at his desk and grabbed a pen and began to write something angrily. Zilk said sullenly that no, he couldn't go to lunch, he hadn't made any progress today, he had to work a little more. Zilk thought wearily that the fish were dancing in his head and singing to his plans for the cooler. The guy decided that this was what thoughts were in the brain of a person who could not concentrate. Zilk put his pen in the inkwell and said wearily that it would be better to unwind a little. The guy went outside and went to the vendors to buy food. The smiling cook asked Zilk what he wanted to buy today. Zilk looked at the boiling soup in the pot and told the man that he wanted tomato soup with seafood. Zilk carefully examined all the seafood that was hanging above the counter. His gaze caught on the claws of a crab. Zilk sighed happily. He was already anticipating a delicious lunch. Zilk told the cook that he would also have a crab skewers. The seller shouted loudly that it was 900 sores. He should definitely come again. Zilk approached the tables. He was lucky enough to find a free one and happily settled down at it. Zilk looked at his lunch with a happy smile, which consisted of soup and crab meat. Zilk said loudly that the food smelled simply wonderful. He would start with the shell crab. Zilk bit off a piece of crab meat and moaned happily. It was very tasty. Zilk imagined a crab in his mind that was all on fire. The guy thought that this juicy taste of the crab spread in his mouth. It was well seasoned and cooked on coals. Zilk came to the conclusion that it was simply delicious. The guy ate all the meat in a few seconds and left only its shell, which he placed next to the bowl of soup. Zilk happily took the bowl of soup and said that this soup looked absolutely delicious. The boy said he would start with the broth. Zilk raised the plate to his mouth and drank the broth. Zilk licked his lips and thought happily that this bright seafood taste with the sour taste of tomatoes, all of this was cooked over a slow fire, and then there was the chili, which gave a pleasant spiciness. Zilk took a spoon and scooped up some of the ingredients. The boy said impatiently that he would now try the soup thickening. Zilk began to quickly eat the remaining food. Zilk put the soup on the table with a wide smile and shouted, "Thanks for the treat." Lunchtime passed, and Zilk decided to walk along the city street. There were a lot of people walking around him. Zilk smiled and said that he had a wonderful lunch. Someone handed over a piece of paper, and the guy took it in his hands. Zilk shouted that he had automatically taken the leaflet. The nice girl who was handing them out was offering someone else sheets of information. The guy sighed heavily. Zilk said tiredly that, okay, it was just a boring leaflet, he would just throw it away. He was about to fold the sheet, but his attention was drawn to the picture. Zilk said in surprise that there would be an orchestra concert. The orchestra was printed on the leaflet in black and white, and the dates of the performance were written above. The musicians entered the main hall where the performance was to take place. The girl with the violin walked quickly, saying that it hurt a lot. She adjusted her shoes, and in her other hand, she had a violin. She awkwardly said that she had bought such uncomfortable shoes. She was about to get blisters and wouldn't be able to walk. The girl who stood with the unusual man who had the head of a dragon. She called this girl Katarina. The woman excitedly shouted that they were already starting. Katarina screamed anxiously for them to come quickly. The girl quickly approached her dream in the orchestra. The performance began when all the guests entered the hall. Zilk looked at the orchestra in surprise. He thought in shock that this was simply amazing. In his past life, he had listened to classical music on CD. Zilk continued to reason that lived sensations are completely different than on TV. The conductor looked at his musicians with a smile and began to quickly wave his baton. Zilk looked at the musicians and thought that this world had its own musical instruments, although they were similar to those from Earth. The guy looked at a very strange instrument that resembled a lump of pipes. Zilk wondered what kind of sound this instrument was supposed to make. It didn't seem like it could work and make a melody without magic. The guy thought that, in this world, the tool doesn't necessarily have to be of a normal shape. If the shape of his cooler is also curved, like this tool. Zilk looked at the instrument again. He thought happily that he could do it. The guy nervously said that while he hadn't forgotten the idea, he really wanted to go home. Evening came, and Zeke returned to his workshop to carry out his plan. Rudge shouted happily that they had done a great job today, but she had to go home, so she went home. Zilk said that she had done a good job today. Rudge slammed the door and went to her house. Zilk looked at his drawing carefully. The guy happily thought that he had come up with a design for a cooler that turned out just great. Tristan called Zilk with a big smile. He asked if maybe they could go and have dinner together at some restaurant with tasty food. Zil looked at him angrily and said that he thought it was a bit creepy when two guys go to a restaurant. Tristan sweated and awkwardly asked what he had said to his boss. Zilk got up from his desk and put on his coat to go home. Zilk told Tristan without emotion that he was going home now. Tristan blocked Zilk's path and shouted loudly for him to stop and not go anywhere. Tristan made a sad face and said that Zilk should understand him. The guy, looked at the boss with hope in his eyes and shouted that he was broke now. Tristan added that he was asking Zilk to lend him some money. Zilk didn't expect this, so he just looked at Tristan for a few seconds. He didn't know what to say. Zil came out of shock and put his hands on Tristan's shoulders. Zil, with a scary expression, asked Tristan that he pays him enough, doesn't he think so? Tristan nervously replied that he had given a gift to his favorite girl from the cabaret club, so he didn't have money for food right now. Zilk angrily straightened his jacket and said that he would just go home now. Tristan grabbed Zilk by the leg and with tears in his eyes, he screamed that no, he couldn't just leave. Zilk tried to throw him off, but he couldn't. Tristan screamed at him that he wanted Zilk to feed him good food. The guy let go of his boss's leg and made a sweet face. He knelt down and looked at Zilk with an innocent look. Tristan said that he was asking Zilk to feed him expensive food. He had never eaten with them before. Zilk turned away from Tristan and thought that, if you think about it, it was a boss's duty to take care of his subordinates. Tristan shouted that he didn't have a penny in his pockets. Zilk groaned tiredly. Tristan and Zilk were walking down the street of the night city. Tristan happily told his boss, who was walking next to him, that he wanted to go to Maigio and eat some tasty meat. Zilk didn't even look at Tristan. He told him that he wouldn't do it. He had just been there. Tristan cried out in surprise. Who did he go to Maigio with? Did he really have a girlfriend or friends? Zilk looked him in the eye and replied that he went there alone. Tristan awkwardly said that he went to the restaurant alone. The guy looked at his boss. Tristan thought that in Maigio's restaurant, people grill meat together, have fun and talk. The boy made a fishing rod of his lips and told his boss that if he couldn't go to Maigio, he should take him wherever he wanted. Zilk told him that was what he was going to do. The boy looked at the sign and stopped. Zilk told Tristan that he apologized, but he needed to go to the artifact shop for a while. Tristan looked at him in horror, and Zilk did not understand such a reaction. Tristan said sadly that he was serious now. If he went in there, it would be for a long time. Tristan shouted at Zilk, who was entering the store, to stop. Zilk and Tristan entered Ardeas's artifact shop, which was filled with various items. A man came out to him, wearing a goat mask with sharp teeth. He was dressed in knightly armor, which was covered with chains. Tristan hid behind Zilk. The guy told his boss that this store's security guard gave him the creeps. He was all armor. Zilk smiled at Tristan's reaction. He told his employee that this guard was obsessed with artifacts. Zilk waved his hand at the guard to say hello. Tristan looked at it all, amazed. He thought in horror that everyone who liked artifacts was crazy. Tristan walked up to the counter with items and asked in surprise why the artifacts were always so expensive. Zilk shouted happily that he would never get tired of coming here. The seller answered the question that of course they always sell for that much. The shop owner, Guan, said that the artifacts, no matter how useful they were unique and couldn't be replicated, so the price was justified. Zilk shook his head in agreement. Tristan thought, no, he definitely didn't understand that. Guan told him that he had cleared them out. He had already visited 3 days ago. Zilk replied that it was okay. He was not against spending money on artifacts. Zilk looked at the chest that Guan had placed in front of him. Zilk asked the owner if he had anything new. Guan looked at the guy and replied that there was something he might even like. Zilk told him to show this artifact. The shop owner took out the item and showed it to Zilk. The guy carefully examined the artifact. Zilk said that at first glance it was a simple cup without a wide rim, without decorations, nothing extra. Zilk asked Guan incredulously what the catch was. Guan told him to watch carefully. The salesman looked at the cup and spoke loudly to fill it. The cup began to shake and fill with liquid. Zilk shouted in amazement that it couldn't be. This cup created carbonated water. Guan replied that he was absolutely right. It was a foam cup. Guan poured the soda into a glass. Zilk thought that in this world, there was only one mysterious source from which soda water was extracted. Therefore, it was difficult to obtain and was a luxury for rich people. Zilk drank the soda water from the glass and put it on the table. Zilk looked into Guan's eyes and asked how much this foam cup was. He wanted to buy it. Tristan asked his boss in surprise that he wanted to buy it. Wasn't it useless? Guan looked at Zilk and shouted loudly that the cup was worth 30 million. Zilk put the bill on the table with a loud slam and shouted that he was buying. The guy with a wide smile began to sign for his purchase. Tristan grabbed Zilk by the shoulders and screamed hysterically that he wanted to spend 30 million. For that kind of money, you could build a huge house in the capital from scratch. Zilk smiled and told his employee that for just 30 million he could now make a carbonated cocktail at any time. He could even use it to open his own bar. Zilk added that there were literally hundreds of ways to use it. Guan smiled and told his customer to rest assured that he could put it to good use. Now he could take the cup. Tristan screamed in shock that he was buying a cup for such money in front of a beggar like him. Zilk was simply mocking him. How could he not be ashamed of himself? Zilk answered him that Tristan had no money only because he did not manage his own finances. Zilk looked at the check that was given to him. He thought with a smile that he loved shopping like this. If he had a wife or children, he would probably be accused of spending money on himself when he should be providing for his family. Zilk went on to say that bachelors are free from responsibility. He plans to live only for himself. It is wonderful to be free from all the problems that a family can bring. Tristan cried out joyfully that they were now going to eat. Zilk firmly replied that he was going home. Tristan, with tears in his eyes, loudly asked why he wouldn't feed him. Zilk looked at the guy and replied that he wasn't going to carry around a 30 million artifact. Tristan asked sadly that Zilk just wanted to use it quickly. He was right. Zilk headed for the exit, saying that he would not deny it. He apologized, but they would go another time. Guan and Tristan looked at the door through which Zilk had come out. Guan said thoughtfully that Zilk had so much money, he was damn handsome, but with such views he would never marry. Tristan said sadly that he was right. Zilk returned to his home when the sun had already completely set. The boy put the cup on the table and joyfully said that it sparkled like a real treasure. Zilk smiled and said that the cup looked just wonderful. The guy rubbed and shook the object. He asked with interest what material it was made of. Zilk smiled and said that in any case, now he could drink sparkling water whenever he wanted. The guy looked at his bar and happily said that for sure. Zilk shouted that he would make a highball cocktail now. Zilk opened the refrigerator drawer and pulled out a large block of ice. He placed it on the table and pulled out a knife and a hammer. Zilk said that at first he thought about using magic to break the ice, but he should be able to do it himself. The guy used tools to divide the ice into several cubes. He shouted happily that he had done it just perfectly. Zilk threw ice cubes into the glass. The guy opened the bottle and poured the alcohol into a glass with ice. He moved it around and then told the cup to fill up. The boy looked happily at the soda that appeared in the magic cup. He poured the soda into the glass. Zilk drank some of the drink and grabbed his head. He said thoughtfully that he might go for a highball. The guy decided to make something tasty. He placed the plate on the table and said with a smile that fried chicken would go best with the drink. Zilk speared a piece of chicken and quickly shoved it into his mouth. Zilk exhaled and shouted that it was hot. He happily continued to eat his dinner. The guy happily said that the ginger and garlic seasoning was perfect. He said that now it was time to pour lemon juice on top. Zilk squeezed lemon juice on the chicken. The guy took a bite of the chicken and thought contentedly that it would be even better with lemon. Zilk grabbed his drink and drank some. He put it down on the table with a loud bang. The guy shouted that it couldn't be better now. He took the magic cup in his hands. Zilk said that such luxury, and only for 30 million. The guy thought that this was the result of his efforts in trying to live a luxurious bachelor life. The guy continued to reason that he was finally living the life of his dreams. Zilk raised his cup and said that a toast should be made to all his efforts that had led him to a happy life. Zilk thought that a lot had happened today. The idea for the design of the cooler had come to him at the concert. He was able to use the musical instrument in his work. The guy continued to reason that he was able to buy such a valuable cup, which cost only 30 million. He got it practically for free from Guan. Zilk raised the magic cup high and shouted joyfully that today was a wonderful day that brought him much happiness. May his dreams come true in the future. The guy continued to shout that next time he would drink a spritzer. Zilk took a deep breath and began to sing loudly. He could be heard even from the street. A girl named Katarina McClare returned from the performance. She said tiredly that she had finally returned home. Katarina said heavily that she was very tired. Katarina slapped her cheeks and screamed loudly that she had to stop. She had to concentrate on the music. The girl thought her name was Katarina McClare. She went on to say that she had left her family home and was living alone to find her own place in the music world. She took off her shoes in irritation. Katarina confidently shouted that she could not survive in the world of music if she could not cope with some loneliness. She had to hold out as long as possible. The girl felt her foot hurt badly. She had rubbed her foot in these shoes after all. Katarina fell to the floor in pain and decided to catch her breath a little. She stood up and walked tiredly to her room. Katarina looked at all the mess she had made. Katarina muttered that she had made a terrible mess. She really needed to clean up her room. Katarina thought that she was little and that servants did everything for her. The girl said with disappointment that because of this, she never did such things herself. She did not clean her room, did not wash clothes, and did not put them away. Katarina fell onto the couch and screamed into her pillow that she would definitely do it next time, but not today. She covered her head with the blanket and sighed tiredly. She mumbled that it was time for her to sleep. The girl lay there for a few seconds, then jumped up from the sofa. Katarina threw off the blanket and screamed loudly that no, it was too early to sleep. She was very hungry. She looked at her food. There were old and dried vegetables that were not fit to eat, as well as meat of unknown origin and unknown expiration date. Katarina turned away from the spoiled food and said that it would be better not to have dinner today. She looked angrily at the refrigerator and said that after all, the refrigerator does not allow you to store food forever. She said with displeasure that it is also very huge. Its creator could not make it a little more compact. She'd already sent letters of request to their creator, Zilk, several times. Luren. She wrote in a letter that the switch on the stove was too tight. It was hard for a woman to turn it. She wanted to use the dryer when she was out of the house. Could he make it more compact? Katarina said that she thought the improved products had not yet started selling. The girl picked up the violin and said heavily that now she needed to practice playing the violin. The girl entered the room, which had a magic soundproofing instrument so that the music could not be heard from outside. She opened her notes. She started playing when she suddenly heard noise from her neighbor's apartment. She looked angrily at the wall and asked discontentedly what the noisy neighbor was, probably some guy. She screamed that she needed to concentrate. Katarina started playing. When again noise was heard from the neighboring apartment, someone was singing some songs very loudly. Katarina kicked the wall with all her anger so that the man would stop and stop bothering her. The girl grabbed her leg and began to roll on the floor in pain. The man continued singing, and Katarina glared at the wall. She pressed her cheek against the wall and shouted loudly that if he was going to sing, he should install soundproofing. Zilk was singing in the next apartment. Zink was walking through the streets of a quiet town and decided to make a quick stop at a coffee shop to grab a bite to eat. He wanted it to be somewhere less crowded. Looking through one of the windows, the guy saw that this was the right place for him. Everything was free inside, so Zink could be alone as he wanted. He walked up to the entrance, holding his suitcase, and looked at the sign. It seemed unfamiliar to him, and the guy asked himself if this coffee shop had always been there. Entering inside, the guy was immediately greeted by a neat worker. The man in a shirt and vest with a neat mustache was just the barista in this place. The man said that Zink could take absolutely any place he liked. The guy walked into the hall and looked around it, noting that the atmosphere here was very calm. After leafing through the menu a bit and getting acquainted with it, Zink immediately said that it would be a standard set for tomorrow, and now all he had to do was choose a drink. After standing for a while and looking around, Zink smelled a familiar smell. He looked at the man who was carefully brewing something with boiling water. Zink looked at him in surprise and asked the owner about the smell. Was that really coffee? The owner also looked at the guy in surprise, his eyes wide open. The barista didn't expect Zink to know what coffee was. Zink replied that he had drunk it a long time ago, so he remembered the aroma very well. Coffee exists in this world, but it has not been able to gain widespread distribution among people. Zink has already drunk all the coffee he managed to find in the capital. The guy took a cup of the hot drink, enjoyed the aroma, and then took a sip. He said that this is not it, and that the beans should be ground. After which the barista agreed with him and poured the ground coffee out of the grinder. The man standing behind the counter put his hand on his chest and said that he had tried it a long time ago, when he was still traveling, and so he decided to open his own coffee shop to do what he loved. But unfortunately, he continued, coffee did not attract customers yet, but the man continued to experiment. Zink consoled him and said that few people can understand all the charm from the first time. Zink also thought that the locals did not know how to enjoy drinks at all. He turned to the owner again and asked the man to make him coffee to go with his breakfast. The man smiled happily and said that he would do everything now. The owner was glad that his interest was shared for the first time in a very long time of being in the capital. The man took a special teapot and began pouring boiling water, which he had just heated, into the lower flask. The water gradually began to fill the bowl, and the glass walls immediately began to fog up. Afterwards, freshly ground coffee was poured in, the grinding of which should not be too fine or too coarse. The man poured in about 12 grams of beans. Afterwards, when he connected the upper flask, placing it on top, the tight rubber connector securely fixed it. The water began to boil, and the water gradually went up, where there was ground grain. In order for the coffee to brew well, it had to be constantly stirred with water so that the process would proceed faster. And so, when the fire below was extinguished, the drink continued to return down through the filter. And, in the end, the owner received the most delicious coffee, which had a unique taste due to the brewing method. He carefully began to pour it into the cup. Then he took the cup and the remains of the drink that were still in the flask and put it on his tray. Soon, he brought out a cup for Zink, and the aristocrat thanked the barista. The quality of the coffee was completely different from what he had been able to make himself. The color was beautiful, and there was no sourness in the aroma at all. Zink put his hand on the counter, smiled, and said that the coffee was very tasty. The owner thanked him for the praise because he was nervous about preparing the drink for someone who had already drunk it before. The owner of the coffee shop approached Zink, wanting to know his name. He said that few people there liked to drink coffee. Then the man brought out a ready-made breakfast and said that his name was Rondell. Zink reached for his cup of coffee, then smiled at Rondell and said his name was Zilk Luren. He was very glad to meet the owner of this place. Plus, Rondell was surprised when the guy told his name. Then the man asked Zink about the business he was doing. Many knew Zink as an inventor. Rondell smiled broadly and then said that such a famous inventor of magical instruments visited his coffee shop. For the owner, it was a real honor. Zink was a little embarrassed and, turning away, said that there was nothing wrong with that. Soon, the door of the coffee shop swung open, and another man in a vest walked inside. It was Mr. Noid. The man held his coat in his hand and then said that they had not seen the owner for a long time. Finally, the man was able to get his well-deserved day off. Rondell greeted Mr. Noid. The owner said that the butler's job was not easy, and he was glad to see him. The butler looked at Zink, who was behind the counter. Coming closer, the man said that there was someone else ordering coffee here besides him. He noted that this was a rarity for such a place, and then winked with one eye. Zink smiled and continued to enjoy his coffee. Noid leaned on the counter and told the owner that he would have the same as Mr. Zink was drinking. The next day, Zink arrived at work. He placed his suitcase on the table, straightened his tie, and greeted his blonde colleague with a "good morning." His friend noticed that Zink was surprisingly in a good mood today. The man continued to sit, propping his head up with his hand. Zink joyfully exclaimed that he was ready to share and tell the reason, but his comrade said that he did not want to know it, because he did not care. Zink smiled and said that the sparkling water from the artifact he bought yesterday made an excellent drink, which went perfectly with fried chicken. Soon, Zinka's secretary came into the office and began to calm Tristan, who was screaming at the top of his lungs. The girl said that Zinka had always been such a person, and this was not the first time. Afterwards, she handed Zink a letter and said that this was another complaint about his invention. Zink took the letter and asked who the complaint was from. The girl laughed and said it was from Katarina. Zink immediately darkened, starting to squeeze the piece of paper. Tristan couldn't stand it any longer and hit the table. He shouted that the complaint was coming again and again from the same Katarina. The boys called her a real snake. Zink had a vision of jellyfish with snakes on their heads. That's how he now imagined Katarina, who was sending him one complaint after another without stopping. The girl said that this same Katarina seemed to have acquired all the magical tools developed by Zink. Tristan was surprised and called her some kind of rich woman. Zink began to read thoughtfully and said that he didn't care how many things she bought. A complaint was a complaint, and it had to be responded to somehow. The girl also took the previous sheets of paper and said that if you read her complaints, it didn't look like the girl was trying to hurt or offend anyone. The letters most often described the inconveniences of everyday use, as well as issues that prevented women from using the tools. Zink put his hand to his chin and said that he agreed with that. In the letters, it was true that one could find some downsides that the guys hadn't noticed during production. Afterwards, the guy said that it was all nonsense. After all, 9 out of 10 women were happy with everything. Therefore, only Katarina had problems, and maybe it was her. Tristan said that this girl doesn't understand anything about magic tools, so why does she write so much about them? It's hard to change anything in the current designs. Zink said that it was true. There were no useless parts inside the magic tools. If they had removed something for the sake of size, nothing would have worked. The girl joyfully exclaimed that they should work and strive for the ideal, and also find a solution for the sake of other clients. She believed that this was the mission of their bureau. Zink waved the letter away and said he didn't care. He didn't want to hear only criticism directed at him. The boy threw the crumpled piece of paper into a bucket, where there were already several complaints. Zink said that he makes magic tools only for his own comfort. Several actors stood in the dressing room, preparing themselves. They discussed going on holiday together, but not everyone was able to get out. Katarina said she almost fell flat on her face during rehearsal. Afterwards, the girl quickly got ready, packed her bag, and ran to the exit. Katarina said that she would arrive home, and she would definitely need to rehearse herself. One of the orchestra members appeared in the room and called out to the girl. It was the orchestra member, conductor Eldoba. The man asked the girl to come to him for a minute. Katarina turned around and asked, dumbfounded, what was wrong. The girl thought that Eldoba had noticed that she had been slacking off during rehearsal and not giving it her all. The conductor handed the girl a piece of paper and said that she had always been interested in composing music. He decided to encourage her passion for this activity. The girl began to get acquainted with what was written, and the man at that time put his hands behind his back and said that for their next concert they needed original music. Usually he composed it, but now he has a lot of other work. The girl looked at the conductor with admiration and could not believe that he relied so much on her. Eldoba said that he had entrusted this matter not only to the girl, but if her piece was the best, they would play it. Katarina was full of confidence and determination, so she immediately agreed. Eldoba smiled encouragingly and made a hand gesture to the girl, saying that she had exactly 1 week to do all this. Afterwards, Eldoba smiled sarcastically and told the girl that he understood how hard it was to compose music, but rehearsals were also very important. Katarina realized that he noticed how lazy she was during rehearsals. The girl didn't know whether she would be able to cope with this task or not. But another chance might not come. But she didn't have much of a choice. She really wanted to start writing her own music for a long time, so she took a piece of paper and began to read the rules. The girl raised her hand, clenched it into a fist, and shouted that this was where her talent would finally be revealed. Catherine McClare was ready to take the title of honorary composer. After thinking for a while about what kind of plan her work would be, the girl grabbed her head in horror, realizing that she had almost no fresh ideas in her head, only emptiness. And so 6 days passed, and the girl still hadn't come up with anything. She kept trying to find inspiration, sitting on the couch at home. It was already evening, and the girl hadn't even rehearsed. Soon, she began to get a little angry with herself, calling to take the whole situation into her own hands. The girl needed to calm down, and she decided that today she would simply skip dinner and sleep less, but she would get the job done. Taking the violin in her hands, the girl thought that first she needed to play something and maybe then something would come to her mind. Again, this task required strong concentration. From the very beginning, she closed her eyes and gradually extracted sounds from her musical instrument. At first, not everything went as smoothly as it could have. And so she tried again and again, soon finding her own tempo and concentration. She was focused, and the music began to come by itself. The girl noted that the rhythm was quite good. Katarina sat at this occupation almost all night. Soon she enthusiastically raised the sheets of paper and shouted that everything was head. Assessing her work, she realized that she had done well, But then she stopped herself, realizing that it was just her neighbor's song, and the girl had simply taken it apart note by note and written it down. As it turned out, Katarina had been listening to music all her life, but her neighbor's songs were something new and unusual. She wondered if her neighbor could be a famous musician. Fearing that it could be plagiarism, the girl scattered all the sheets of paper around the room, saying that she would not hand in this work. Her pride did not allow the girl to use this melody. Taking up the instrument again, the girl told herself that she would have no trouble composing a new melody since she had already caught the necessary warm-up. Meanwhile, it was late at night outside. So, the next day, Katarina ran to the music class as fast as she could. The girl entered the room with disheveled hair and immediately apologized for being late. In the center of the office stood the conductor Eldoba, holding his pointer. The man turned toward the door and told Katarina that she need not worry, since not everyone had arrived yet. Katarina ran in and sat down in her place. Eldoba turned to her again and reminded her that today was the day of the music exam. He asked the girl if she had managed to do everything, to which he received a positive answer. The girl said that she would get everything now. In a rush, opening the bag, she drops the entire composition on the floor. Katarina apologizes for dropping everything. Eldoba comes up, starts picking up the sheets, and smiles. She said she had been up most of the night finishing the last part. The man began to study her work thoughtfully. Katarina stood waiting, a little tense. She was very worried about her work as Eldoba continued to turn the pages, constantly showing different emotions. Suddenly, Katarina realized that she had been in such a hurry that morning that she had accidentally put down the first version of the music. She reached for the sheets of paper in horror, but the conductor held out his hand. He silently motioned to the girl to be quiet for now. The conductor studied the melody very closely, completely absorbed in the piece that had struck him. Suddenly, Eldub's eyes began to sparkle with amazement. The man said that it was a wonderful work. The first one was mediocre, but the second one looked fresh and innovative. The girl realized that it was the work that she wrote herself that was that spontaneity. She looked gloomy, and Eldoba said that he would show her to the others and they would settle on the second option. The second option was the girl's neighbor's melody. Katarina prayed that this work would not be chosen and put on public display. Zilk had already taken his place in the orchestra hall. He waited with a serious face for the performance of the musicians to begin. A lot of spectators had gathered. When everyone started playing the piece, Zilk realized that the piece was very similar to the music he liked in his past life. It was amazing. Conductor Eldoba continued waving his baton, indicating the key. Zilk thought that if he listened more carefully, he could understand it exactly. The guy closed his eyes and enjoyed it. He soon realized that it was that same melody, exactly the same. It nostalgically brought back good memories of the moments before his reincarnation. In the end, Katarina came up with a great composition. It was the same music she had heard as a child, sitting by the window where she could hear her neighbor. The entire orchestra of musicians rejoiced. They shouted to the girl that all the tickets for the next concert had already been sold out, which was a colossal breakthrough and success. Katarina began to feel embarrassed, and the others continued to say that the girl had already said before that she wanted to compose her own composition, but who would have thought that she would create such a masterpiece the first time? Everyone began to surround the girl with smiles on their faces and began to congratulate her on her triumph. Katarina was very embarrassed at this moment, thanking those around her. Soon, the conductor Eldoba raised his hand and waved to the girl. He called out to Katarina and asked her to come to him for a few minutes. The girl began to make her way out of the crowd. When she approached, another adult man, who stood next to Eldoba, immediately appeared in front of her. He asked the conductor about the author of this beautiful composition. Eldoba smiled and modestly introduced the man. He pointed at him and said that this was the director of the opera house, Marco Monbacino, a very famous man in his circles. Katarina smiled and made a small bow, holding her dress. The girl said that she was glad to meet him, and then introduced herself to him. The girl understood that this man was a very big shot in the community of musicians. Marco said that moments like these, when young talents show themselves, always make his heart flutter. Afterwards, Marco solemnly raised both hands up, pointing his index fingers at the ceiling. The man said that thanks to Katarina, his opera house was now on everyone's lips. Then Marco put both hands behind his back and, without ceasing to smile, said that he did not want to miss such a wonderful opportunity. Katarina, however, did not understand what was being said at first. Marco spread his arms wide and asked the girl to write another composition. He also added that he understood how difficult it would be to surpass this composition, but he was confident in its success. Marco bowed and began to walk away, towards the exit. A joyful Eldoba turned to the girl and asked her if she could repeat her success. Katarina agreed. Afterwards, the girl returned home. She was full of emotions. She had definitely achieved success among her comrades and superiors, but now she needed to write another composition. She grabbed her head and started screaming. The girl understood perfectly well that she would not be able to surpass the composition they played at the performance. In addition, she remembered that the composition she wrote herself, Eldoba appreciated as spontaneity. With her abilities, the girl thought that she would not satisfy the ears of even ordinary listeners. And about Eldoba and Margot, there was even less need to talk. Suddenly, she got the idea that she could overhear her neighbor's song again and write an arrangement for it, breaking it down into notes. So, after the rehearsal, the girl went home and spent the whole day eavesdropping on her neighbor, hoping that he would finally start singing something. The girl took her instrument and stood by the wall for a long time. She still couldn't make out the music that was playing. Surprisingly, the neighbor was very modest today, and that wasn't enough. Soon, she was again sketching out her own music. Katarina thought that perhaps she should give up and say that she couldn't come up with anything new for now. But if she couldn't hear her neighbor today, she didn't know when he would sing next time. The girl encouraged herself by saying that she had to take a chance. The girl got out of her house and went straight to the neighbor's door. She pressed herself against it and began to listen, trying to recognize the sounds of the song. When the girl was already kneeling by the door, she suddenly noticed that the sound had stopped. At that very moment, the door began to open and pushed the girl to the floor. A man looked out of the door and began to look at the girl who was sitting at his threshold. Katarina rubbed her forehead, saying that it hurt a lot. At some point, opening her eyes, she raised her head up and saw a guy standing in the doorway. She stared in surprise, as did he at her. This neighbor was Zilk himself. Zilk was at home preparing dinner. The guy opened the cabinet where he kept his spices and began examining the jars. He couldn't find the ingredient he was looking for. As it turned out, he was out of ground ginger. Zilk decided that he would have to make fried chicken without it. But then he slammed the cabinet shut and gritted his teeth. Zilk said that without ginger, the dish would not be tasty at all. Then he straightened his clothes and prepared to go to the store. Quickly putting on his outerwear, Zilk rushed to the door, glancing at the time. The market should still be open. He hated shopping there, but he had to. And then he collided with Katarina, who was sitting by the door. Zilk quickly opened the door and hit the girl on the forehead, leaving a small mark. Zilk didn't know Katarina yet. The girl continued to sit, and the gloomy guy began to think about who this strange woman was and what she was doing near his door. The girl began to rise to her feet, and Zilk stared at her, still not saying a word. It seemed that he had seen her somewhere before, but then the guy thought that he might be imagining it. Katarina lost her temper and dropped her hands and screamed, telling the guy to be careful when he opened the door. She was very angry, and it was visible on her face. Zilk was embarrassed by this cry and folded his hands together. The guy said that the girl herself crept up to his door, pretending to pass by. Afterwards, Zilk slightly bowed his head and said that he had no idea who she was. Afterwards, the guy asked the purpose of the girl sitting glued to his door. The girl continued to scream indignantly, denying everything. Zilk said that if she continued to lie to him, he would tell everything to the house security and then called the girl a stalker. The guy said that ordinary passers-by don't sit at other people's doors. Katarina fell silent, hesitantly starting to say something while Zilk pierced her with his gaze. Zilk became more serious with each passing second, and Katarina gave in. She folded her hands and began to apologize, saying that she would explain the reason if the boy did not complain to anyone. She lowered her eyes in disappointment. Zilk thought that she was about to tell him the truth. The guy said that he would listen to the girl without giving her away. Katarina was very shy and asked where they would talk. Then she added that she lived nearby, but it would be better not to go to her place. Then she added that it would also be very strange to go to Zilk's. The guy began to get indignant when he heard that the girl, as it turned out, was his neighbor. After that, Zilk went out into the hallway and told the girl to grab some outerwear. Then they went outside and the guy led her towards the coffee shop. When they went inside, Katarina enthusiastically looked around the interior of Rondell's establishment and said that it was very beautiful. Zilk did not really like her noisy company. Then the guy thought that next time it would be better if he came alone. Taking off his coat, the guy asked the girl about the drink she would like to drink. Katarina picked up the menu and began to study it. The girl said that she had not yet decided and, continuing to look at the pages of the menu, added that she did not even know what to choose. Zilk continued to analyze her actions. The guy sat opposite and saw that the girl was choosing slowly, which was strange to him. Afterwards, the girl said what she had chosen. Rondell came to the table and began writing down the order with a pen. Zilk, smiling at the owner, said that he would like coffee. Katarina wanted to order green tea, but when she heard about coffee, she immediately got excited. The girl suddenly looked at the menu and said that she did not find coffee there. Zilk folded his arms and explained that the drink was not on the regular menu, but it was on the special menu. The next moment, Katarina slammed the menu shut and said that in that case, she would also like coffee. This pleased Rondell, who, standing next to her, immediately smiled. Zilk was indignant, trying to explain to the girl that coffee tasted bitter and not everyone would like it. If the girl had never drunk it, then it was better not to start. Katarina proudly declared, raising her hand higher. She pointed to herself and said that green tea also tasted bitter. If they were similar, then the girl could easily cope. Then she repeated that there would also be coffee. Zilk exchanged glances with Rondell, who continued to smile. The man said he understood the order and would make 2 coffees. The girl reached for a handkerchief to wipe her hands. Zilk noticed that there was elegance, lightness, and a certain grace in her movements. Katarina continued to sit and smile. The apartment building they lived in was not cheap. This meant that either the girl earned well or was from a wealthy family. The girl decided to break the pause between the guys and said that while they were waiting for their drinks, they could introduce themselves to each other. Zilk said that was a good idea. Katarina started first, saying that she was Katarina McClare, the second daughter of the McClare family. It was obvious that she was proud of it. The girl added that she played the violin in the Capitol Orchestra. Zilk folded his arms and was surprised by the last fact about the girl. He asked her again about the Capitol Orchestra, continuing to stare at her a little displeasedly. Afterwards, Zilk went back in time and remembered Katarina. Right, that's where he saw her. The guy said he saw her recently at the theater. Katarina was glad that Zilk was present at her concert. Afterwards, she smiled very sweetly, folding her hands under the table. The girl asked the guy's name, and Zilk quipped that the stalker didn't know the name of the one she was following. The guy exhaled and also folded his hands and looked at Katarina. Then he calmly said that his name was Zilk Luren and he was the inventor of magical instruments. The girl's face darkened, and then she stood up and pointed her finger at her interlocutor. She shouted that she had written many complaints to his office and nothing had changed. At that moment, Zilk narrowed his eyes in disdain and began to recall those very complaints of Katarina. Zilk stood up and said that Katarina was a snake. He said that it wasn't enough for the girl to send him her letters to the office all the time, so she decided to show up at his house. Katarina started to lose her temper and said that she had only just found out that she had been living next to Zilk all this time. If she had known earlier, everything would have been different. Both interlocutors were very angry. At this point, Rondell came up and thanked me for waiting. It was very awkward to butt into such a situation, but something had to be done. The owner of the coffee shop began to put drinks on the table. The man said that he also brought extra sugar and milk if anyone wanted to dilute their coffee. Zilk turned to Rondell and thanked the man. Katarina, meanwhile, held up her cup and said that the coffee smelled nice. It was the first time she had seen the dark drink. Afterwards, continuing to sniff, the girl also noticed that the coffee was hot, so she had to be careful. She carefully began to bring the coffee and tasted it. Taking a sip, the girl immediately moaned that it was very bitter. Zilk smiled, because for him it was an obvious outcome. Katarina said that she would have managed, as she said, but it was too much. Zilk was enjoying his drink and pointed to the additives nearby. The guy said that if she found the coffee bitter, she could add milk and it would be easier to drink. Katarina looked at the milk jug and reached for it. The milk was also warm, and the girl said that she would try adding it. Then she began to slowly pour the milk inside. The girl looked indignantly into her cup and said that the color of the drink had changed greatly. Zilk smiled and urged her to try it again. When Katarina took her next sip, she very slowly took the cup back and solemnly declared that it was very good. Her eyes were shining with amazement. Katarina threw back her cup and said that she could drink that. Zilk thought that they had escaped with something, because if the girl had not liked the coffee, she might, in his opinion, have been rude to the owner. Having put down his cup, Zilk folded his arms again and began a dialogue. The guy asked what the girl was doing at his door if she wasn't going to leave another complaint about his invention. Katarina was a little embarrassed and began to get nervous again. The girl said that she could assure that she did not do all this for the sake of some complaint. Zilk repeated that he was waiting for the real reason. Katarina said that the story was long and she would tell it if the guy didn't mind. Zilk said that it would be better if she shortened it. The girl started telling him everything and soon finished. Zilk looked at her in surprise and asked if she was serious about using his song. Now the guy understood why the melody seemed familiar to him. He saw the furor and concluded that if the girl's first song was successful, she was asked to compose another one. Katarina confirmed, bowing her head down. Zilk continued his questioning, saying that the girl had not thought of anything better than to sit under his door and listen until he sang again. Zilk turned his head to the side and said that he understood everything. In his opinion, the girl was not a stalker, but a voyeur. Katarina stood up and indignantly said that this was all wrong. She shouted that the guy himself was to blame, since he could be heard through the wall. Zilk admitted this, but then said that this did not give her the right to sit at another person's door. Katarina, however, continued to sit embarrassed and, folding her palms, asked for forgiveness. She asked if Zilk was angry that she used his song. Zilk got up from the table, threw on his coat, and said that since he had disturbed the girl's studies with his singing, they were now even. Moreover, he was not a musician, and this song was not his composition. Afterwards, Zilk turned around and said that he was going home. Katarina did not understand his last words and stood up, quickly grabbing the edge of his clothes. She wanted him to stop. The girl also got up from the table and said that she might have heard wrong, but Zilk had just said that it was not his song at all, as she thought. Zilk turned around in surprise, and then smiled at the girl. He thought that if he told her the truth, she would think he was crazy. Then Zilk said that in this country he was the only one who knew her. Katarina first thought that it really was a song that no one knew except him. The girl grabbed his coat again and said that the guy probably had more such masterpieces. The girl said that she could play them. Zilk said he wasn't interested, and she could find another fool. Katarina grabbed his clothes tightly and wasn't going to let go until the guy agreed. Zilk continued to resist for a while, telling her to sort out her own problems. But then he agreed. He turned to the girl who had told him about the deal between them. Zilka was slightly interested in this. He was interested in what she could offer him, so without taking off his outerwear, he sat back down at the table, saying that he would listen to Katarina. The girl said that he could give her his songs, and she would play them. For this, she would give him 40% of the fee for the performances, and the earnings from one melody would be about 300,000. Zilk thought about it and said that it all sounded pretty good, but he wasn't sure that every tune would make money. Besides, he didn't need the money since he was an inventor. Zilk said that if he wanted, he could get any amount himself. Katarina was stunned. She realized that the guy could really get as much money as he wanted. Afterwards, Zilk raised his finger and said that the girl could offer him something unusual, for example, some treasure or artifact, because she was from a noble family. Katarina said something quietly and then thought about it. She said that she had something, if her memory serves her right. Zilk stood up and asked what kind of artifact the girl had. Katarina boldly declared that she had a sound garden. This device could record about 5 songs and play them whenever she wanted. Zilk immediately understood what was being talked about. Most likely, the girl was talking about the player or radio that were in his past world. This greatly interested him. He immediately agreed to this deal. But Katarina said that this thing was very expensive. Zilk said that he would give her as many songs as she wanted, and if she didn't like it, he would be ready to pay extra in money. Katarina realized that the guy loved artifacts. She later said that she often uses it herself, as she turns on music on it to listen to. Zilk began to get up and said with a smile that in that case their conversation was over. He asked Katarina to write to him when she decided. The girl grabbed the guy's clothes, and she said she agreed. She explained that her future depended on Zilka, so it was an acceptable deal for her. After they got home, the girl went into the apartment behind the sound garden. It was quite late outside. Soon, she appeared in the hallway with a small box. The device itself was very similar to a stereo speaker. Zilk took it in his hands and said with delight that it was an amazing invention. He was happy with such a deal. He took it in his hands, and the guy rushed towards his apartment, saying goodbye to Katarina. The girl called out to Zilka and mentioned the complaints she had written. She asked him with disdain whether he had read them or not. Zilk replied that he had not. And then Katarina started to get indignant. He added that he had no free time. Katarina pointed at him and said that he was an inventor of magical instruments. The opinions of the customers should come first. because he should strive to improve his inventions. Zilk said that it's not that simple, and then he added that complaints should be written more logically and not guided only by one's feelings. And before writing complaints, the girl could first at least understand a little better how magical instruments work in general. Afterwards, Zilk said goodbye and closed his door. When the door closed and Katarina remained outside, Zilk carried the column into the distance of the room, where he wanted to get to know it as soon as possible and understand how it worked. The sound garden had all the buttons you'd need: play, pause, record, delete, rewind, and 5 melody selection buttons. Zilk thought it had all the same functions as the player in his world. Suddenly, the guy noticed that Katarina hadn't been particularly careful with the thing. There were dirt accumulations under the buttons and dust in places where it was difficult to wipe. Zilk armed himself with a rag and thought that this was definitely not the way to treat artifacts. As he continued to clean it, the guy silently scolded Katarina and said that the player could now not worry, they would take good care of him. So, when everything was ready and the sound garden was sparkling with cleanliness, Zilk intended to test the device. Katarina said that it was quite easy to use. After examining the panel with his eyes for a bit, Zilk immediately realized that the Roman numerals indicated the choice of the recorded track. The device recorded in the same way as the dictaphones in Zilk's world. Pressing the button 1 music immediately began to play in the room. Zilk smiled and relaxed as much as possible, enjoying this very feeling that he had missed. The first melody was played on a violin. Zilk reached into the artifact and wanted to make it sound a little louder. The guy found the right switch and turned it to the side. The music started playing much louder than before. Zilk continued to rejoice, spreading his arms out to the sides. He shouted that it was simply wonderful. Now it was necessary to listen to everything that was recorded here. If he didn't like something, the guy could ask his musician friends to record something for him. But soon the guy realized that the violin played on all 5 compositions. Apparently, this was recorded by Katarina herself when she played at home, at a rehearsal, or on the street. Soon there was a knock on the wall, and Zilk immediately pressed pause. He turned and shouted, wanting to know what his neighbor wanted and why she was disturbing his peace. Katarina yelled back that the music was too loud. If he was going to listen to music through the sound garden, he definitely needed soundproofing now. The guy realized that she was indeed right and apologized. Zilk thought that he would never need soundproofing again, but here the reason was not secret negotiations and business conversations, but the girls who complained that they were always being eavesdropped on. Zilk lifted the artifact again, and his eyes lit up brightly. It was time to find its hidden functions, because there were probably a couple of them. Most artifacts have not only one hidden function, but even several, which the user might not even guess about. Zilku once told Guan about this. The guy started trying to combine different types of button presses. He tried double pressing, then holding down several buttons at once, and then started poking everything in a row. And then a voice came from the speaker, congratulating the listener on finding the 6th secret recording. Zilk realized that this was exactly what he was looking for. Putting the sound garden back on the table, the boy continued listening to the recording. The voice said that his name was Selba McClare, is the one who used this artifact. Then addressed the listener directly, saying that most likely the recording was being listened to by Katarina's new friend, or maybe even her boyfriend, or even her husband. This artifact was given to Katarina for her birthday. Most likely, when someone finds this entry, the author assumed that he would no longer be alive. It was Katarina's grandfather or great-grandfather. Zilk thought that he was very sorry because the granddaughter or great-granddaughter gave this artifact to the first person she met. Words came from the speaker that seemed to be a request, but the voice asked to keep all this a secret from Katarina. If the girl was nearby, the voice asked to press the delete and pause buttons at the same time. Zilk continued listening, and when the voice began to say that in addition to his wife, he also had a mistress, at that moment, Zilk immediately hit the buttons with 2 fingers. The guy understood that he didn't want to burden himself with other people's problems, but he couldn't show it to Katarina either, because it seemed she shouldn't know about it. Then his friends, with whom he worked together in his company producing magical artifacts, came to Zilk. The girl said that negotiations with suppliers were dragging on. They sat at Zilk's for a while, and since it was already dark, they started to get ready. Tristan said that he would take Rudge home, but she said that the guy was kind of unreliable. Tristan started shouting, pointing his finger at Zilk, and said that their master of magic tools was actually a B rank. Tristan said that even he wasn't that weak. Zilk then said that if the girl was afraid to return late, he could lend her artifacts for self-defense, and that way she would be able to fight off any villain. Rudge thought it was a good idea, since self-defense artifacts usually looked like regular jewelry. Zilk said they wouldn't stand out or interfere with the girl's everyday life. Afterwards, Rudge extended her hand and said that she was afraid that her husband would become jealous when he saw the girl wearing jewelry from another man. The husband could ask about it at home. Tristan said that Zilk has artifacts worth millions. Although, even if it is for self-defense, wearing jewelry from another man is still somehow wrong. Zilk looked questioningly at the girl and said that it would not be a gift. Zilk simply offered to lend the artifact for the safety of his employee. Afterwards, the guy said that his assistants do not understand anything at all. But Tristan kept saying that it would definitely hurt a man's heart. Rudge was a little embarrassed and said it was still very sweet. Tristan thought she was right, but Zilk didn't see anything wrong with the gesture. Afterwards, Zilk raised his hands and started waving them. The guy told the boys to leave him alone and go home more carefully. Rudge smiled and said that they had done a good job today. Zilk took his suitcase and also went outside. He decided to take a walk in the fresh air, and looking up, the guy noticed how beautiful it was. There were, surprisingly, a lot of stars in the sky. In a previous life, because of the lights of apartment buildings and street lamps, the stars were almost invisible, so it was rare to enjoy this. Soon, Zilk lowered his head and shook it from side to side. The guy realized that he had been too distracted by his gaze, and now did not understand where he had come out and where he was. Passing by some sign that was not level, the guy saw the sign, Ice Rock. He wanted to go back to the main street, but then decided that maybe it was not the time. Zilk came closer to the sign and straightened it. The guy thought it was some kind of bar, so we could have a little drink and then head back home. When he went inside, Zilk saw that the place was very beautiful, and yes, it was indeed a bar. The place was very spacious and cozy in appearance. At such a late hour, there were almost no people. A silhouette of a man appeared behind the bar. When he came into the light, it was clear that he was the bartender. The girl greeted Zilk, who continued to stand at the door. Zilk looked at the girl and thought that the elf, who was beautiful and elegant, was probably hired to attract customers, and there were no people here at all. Therefore, the guy realized that the quality here is not very good, since there is no one. He put his hand on the door handle and said that this was a women's bar, and that this was not appropriate for him. The elf behind the counter said that the guest must have a drink before leaving. She explained that it was bad manners to leave just like that. Zilk turned around and decided that he wouldn't be ignorant and would have a drink anyway, and then he would decide what the problem with this place was. He walked up to the counter and sat down opposite the girl. Elphika, who continued to wipe the glass, asked what the gentleman would order. Zilk said that he could make it at the bartender's discretion. The girl winked, and a crystal formed in front of her. Soon she began to gracefully wave her arms, and several different ice crystals of different sizes began to swirl in front of her, and the bartender herself was very confident. Zilk noticed that the girl was using ice magic. It was a very complex magic that was not easy to control. At the same time, Zilk did not understand what this elf was doing here. Zilk continued to watch the girl do all this with wide eyes. There was no doubt that she was a skilled mage. Suddenly, she reached for a small dish. When she picked it up, all the ice crystals began to fall into it. And then, when the girl put the bowl down, she began to take some bottles from the shelves. The boy watched closely what the girl was doing. He looked at the bottles and realized that she was making him a daiquiri. This drink was also in this world. A little rum, lime juice, and a drop of sugar. The girl had already added rum and lime juice, and now she had to add syrup. The bartender reached for a small bottle, and Zilk saw that it contained a pink liquid. This confused him a little, and the guy tried to stop the bartender, deciding to find out what it was. The girl said it was the nectar of the 1,000-day flower. The 1,000-day flower blooms only once every 1,000 years. In addition, it blooms for only a couple of hours, so its value to such an industry was simply enormous. Zilk was a little confused and asked, having a slight suspicion. The guy did not think that they used such, but the bartender said that this nectar is best combined with this cocktail. But Zilk didn't see anything like a blender in the bar where this cocktail was prepared. He didn't understand what the girl would do next. The bartender put everything in a transparent glass, similar to part of a shaker, and then raised her hands. The glass flew up and magic began to swirl around it, mixing the drink. Zilk thought there was too much magic here for a bar. The girl took a mint leaf and put it on top. Then she thanked him for waiting and handed him the cocktail, saying that the daiquiri was ready, even the name was the same. Zilk thought that the most important thing was the taste. It was prepared very beautifully, of course, but if the cocktail was not as it should be, then everything was done in vain. The cocktail itself should have been sour in taste, and the ice should have been finely crushed into it. Zilk reached for the beautiful cocktail glass and began to taste. He was amazed by what he felt. For a second, these sensations seemed to transport him to the snowy mountains. Everything was as it should be, a refreshing taste, fine ice, and the perfect taste of alcohol. The guy was stunned and extremely amazed. Zilk raised his hand and pointed to the cocktail, saying that it was very tasty. The girl smiled and said that she knew a lot about it. As he finished his drink, Zilk thought that he hadn't expected a cocktail with magic to be so delicious. The bartender must have had a lot of experience and had spent a long time developing the recipe and technique. Afterwards, Zilk stood up a little, leaned his hands on the counter, and made a small bow to the girl behind the bar. He said that he wanted to apologize for calling the bar a women's bar. The girl laughed, saying that she was not surprised by such a comment because there were many similar establishments around. The girl also added that she likes to provoke people with her behavior. Afterwards, Zilk smiled and winked at the girl. He asked if she could make him another one of those drinks. The girl smiled and said that it wouldn't be a problem. Zilka's laboratory. He was gradually developing his new magical coffee grinder, which he was going to use himself. Tristan lifted his glasses and noticed that Mr. Zilk was in high spirits again today. Zilk said that was true, to which Tristan thought about the technician's new find. Zilk shared with the guy, telling him that he found a great bar where the atmosphere was just gorgeous and perfect. Tristan assumed that Zilk would not take him to this bar either. Afterwards, Zilk added that he had recently managed to get an artifact from a violinist named Katarina. These days had definitely been great and had greatly affected Zilk's mood. Tristan came closer to the gentleman and put his hands on his hips. The guy said that he had been wondering for quite some time what Zilk was trying to make now. Rudge appeared behind him, looked out with a smile on her face, and said that she, too, would be very curious to know about it. Zilk picked up the tool and said that in one cafe he drank a drink called coffee. That's why he came up with the idea to make a tool for grinding coffee beans. Zilk mentioned that he could, of course, go to that coffee shop any time to get coffee, but he wanted to be able to drink coffee both at work and at home. This is what prompted the guy to make his own coffee grinder. Tristan looked at the guy in surprise. It turned out that the guys didn't know anything about coffee beans. Zilk said that in that case, it was not surprising that the drink was not widespread in that country. Tristan began to shout, saying that Zilk was collecting something that no one needed again. Tristan said that it would be better to make something that would make them rich, because then Zilk could make a lot of people happy and it would benefit the workshop. Zilk asked Tristan to be quiet, saying that sometimes he could create magical tools that were only useful to him. Tristan ran to Rudge and started complaining to her. Rudge said that Zilk always collects first what he wants himself. Tristan thought that this thing would not sell, and Zilk angrily replied that it was not all about money. Rudge walked up to the table and proudly said that selling what Zilk had created, that's part of their job. She had no idea what kind of drink it was, but she would try to create demand for the instrument. Zilk continued his work, saying that he was happy with this conclusion. Soon the guy announced that everything was ready. He created both a manual machine and an automatic one. After the boy finished his work, he immediately started getting ready, saying that it was time for him to move out. Rudge and Tristan were surprised because it was too early. Zilk had already approached the door, put on his outerwear and opened it a little, turned to the guys and said that he still had to check whether both coffee grinders were working or not. Then he turned to the boys again and said that they had all worked late yesterday, so when they had finished all their work, they could leave early too. Rudge waved her hand at him. Zilk went out for a small picnic, which he organized for himself. The guy made a small tent and took with him a table, a chair, and a small portable tool, which was like a refrigerator. After he had everything set out, the guy began to lay out on the table what he had come here for. Having put down a bag of coffee and 2 coffee grinders, Zilk decided that he would immediately make himself a cup of the drink. Here, his solitude was interrupted by a fair-haired boy who was gradually approaching the tent. Zilk heard him greet him and then say that they met again. Zilk stared silently at the guy, who was very happy to meet him. Afterwards, he asked him if he was going to live here, but the guy immediately shook his head and said that it was just a coincidence. The guy started talking and wanted to make sure Zilk was listening. But Zilk was deep in thought. considering the possibility that it was happening right now. It was when Zilk came here for coffee that this guy showed up. Suddenly, another voice was heard. She called the blonde guy, calling him Eith. The girl came closer and asked about what was happening here and what the guys were doing. Zilka even more angry, as he wanted solitude and privacy. The guy apologized and said that this girl really wanted to go with Eith. Afterwards, it seemed to Hilku that it was all somehow illogical, because it was the girl who wanted to go with him, and not he who wanted to take her with him. The girl thought that the guys knew each other. Eith began to scratch his head and said that it was so. The girl smiled and asked Zilk his name. The guy then thought that Zilk had never called him, but he knew Eith's name. Zilk bowed his head, exhaled, and said that he was Zilk Luren. The girl exclaimed enthusiastically and said that she had heard this name more than once and began to remember where. She immediately said that Zilk was the genius who created many magical instruments. Zilk squinted and said that this was exactly so, but he did not consider himself a genius. The blonde guy put his hand on his neck and said that Rudge was talking about her boss, and it turned out to be Zilk himself. Zilk was surprised that Eith knew about Rudge. Eith smiled and began to talk, saying that Rudge often put out orders to extract resources. He thought that Rudge was telling the guy about adventurers. Zilk said that he usually gave her instructions on what resources he needed. Where she got it all didn't bother the guy, since it was all entirely up to her. When something couldn't be bought at the market, adventurers were often hired to get the necessary goods and resources. Eith exclaimed, saying that it was a funny coincidence. The girl began to clap her hands, and then said that now it was her turn to introduce herself. She put her hand on her chest and said that she was also an adventurer like Eith. Her name was Mariel. After the girl introduced herself, Zilk said that everything was clear to him. Mariel began to complain about the weak reaction, and Eith explained that the guy was not very emotional. Afterwards, Eith turned to the inventor of the magical instruments and asked Zilk what he was doing today. The guy saw some strange things on the table. Zilk smiled and proudly said that this was a prototype of a magical tool that grinds coffee beans, so today he was going to make coffee. Zilk didn't expect any violent reaction, but Eith immediately exclaimed in surprise. He couldn't believe that Zilk was going to make coffee. As it turned out, he knew about this drink. Eith began to explain to the girl about coffee. He said that this drink has a rather specific, bitter taste, but Eith simply adored it. That's why he showed such interest. Afterwards, Eith leaned over to Zilk and began asking him in detail about the device he had invented. Zilk was already beginning to get tired of such an emotional company. After Zilk explained the purpose of his tools, Eith exclaimed that he would like a cup of coffee now, too, at least a little. Mariel also supported him. At this point, Zilk raised his cup and thought that perhaps it would be better if several people tried the coffee. Then he told the boys to bring their cups. Hiet was delighted with this answer and rushed towards his tent. The guy said that his cup was inside and he would bring it here right away. Mariel's eyes widened and she told Eith to also take her cup that was in her bag. Eith agreed and ran inside the adventurer's tent. After he left and disappeared inside, there was an awkward pause between the boys. Zilk continued to grind coffee in silence, feeling somewhat embarrassed. Afterwards, he brought the coffee grinder up and inhaled the aroma of freshly ground coffee. The guy thought that it was not strange that the girl's mug was also in Eith's tent, and so they were left alone. Zilk did not even know what to talk about with Mariel. The girl also remained silent and thought about what she should say now. Suddenly, Mariel turned to Zilk. She asked the boy about how long they had known Eith, because the girl was surprised by their acquaintance. Zilk explained that they had only met recently and were seeing each other for the second time in their lives. The guy knew nothing about him. Mariel, however, noted that they were communicating as if they had known each other for a long time. Afterwards, she bowed her head and quietly said that Eith was not often so happy, which was why she decided to find out about their communication. Zilk wondered what Eith was usually like. The girl said that it wasn't that he wasn't friendly, because the guy was very reliable and kind, but he always seemed to distance himself from his party members, including her. Today, for example, she had to beg the guy to take her with him. Zilk said that when they first met, the guy persistently asked to eat Zilk's smoked meats. I've kept trying to find Mariel's mug. The girl said that this was what was so strange to her, that's why she was so surprised. As if Eith himself was more open than with the others. Afterwards, Mariel shouted, asking the boy to teach her how to be friends with Eith. She really wanted to impress him, but all her attempts failed miserably. Actually, Zilk thought so. He said that asking him about it was useless, so all these attempts could be abandoned. He himself did not know why he had such an effect on Eith. Mariel took her weapon in her hands and said that Zilk was definitely hiding something. She saw from the adventurer's gaze that there was some kind of connection between them. Zilk, however, did not understand at all what exactly the girl had in mind. She put her two hands together and began to beg the guy to help her in this difficult task for a girl. Afterwards, she became a little embarrassed, looked away, and quietly said that she loved Ida. This is how she wanted to show the importance of communication with the guy. Zilk paused for a moment, then sighed. He didn't really want to get involved in all this, especially since the guy always avoided other people's problems. The guy realized that he had first helped Katarina with the music, and now he seemed to have been written down as a cupid. At this time, Eith happily continued running with cups and decided to bring something that goes well with coffee. The guy lowered his eyes again and then put forward a speech that seemed to have already been prepared. Zilk said he was a bachelor and that the girl was going to consult him on any issues. Continuing to turn his hand coffee grinder, the guy tried to convey to Mariel how pointless all this was, because he really couldn't help here. Mariel was truly shocked by what she just heard. The girl was so surprised by these words that she even had to cover her mouth with her hand. She began to question Zilk, assuming that he was not married. Zilk said that this was true, and yet he didn't even have a girlfriend that he loved. Mariel slammed the table and screamed that Zilk was a handsome man and an inventor of magical tools, which made him look smart and rich, and she didn't understand why he was alone. Zilk started to get a little angry after Mariel told him that the guy was bound to give birth to a whole generation of geniuses. Then she added that the guy was bound to have no end of girls. The guy began to remember what simply irritated him. As soon as any woman found out that he was not married, she immediately considered it her duty to become an annoying matchmaker. Zilk thanked the girl for worrying about him, but then said that in her place it would be better to worry about her and Eith. But then he realized that he had reminded the girl once again about the adventurer. Mariel started rubbing her chin and thought, Eith and Zilk got along well, and maybe it was because they were similar, so the guy pushed her away. She also remembered that he is 28 years old, and he has never been married either. Mariel then looked sarcastically toward Zilk, who continued to avoid her gaze. The guy exhaled and then said that in this world there are other people, besides us and Eith, who, despite their age, also would not want to get married. While continuing to grind coffee, Zilk also said that perhaps some of them might one day change their minds and find their other half. Mariel clenched her fist and said that Zilk was now telling her that Eith wanted to be a bachelor too. Zilk said that she definitely wouldn't know until she asked the guy herself. Maybe Eith has never had a girl he wanted to marry. Maybe someday this funny guy will want to have a wedding. Mariel continued to insist, saying that if he was the same as Zilk, then what about her, the girl who wanted to marry him? How could she change her mind now? Zilk was already testing the second grinder, holding the top lid on it. He said that if he wanted a long-term relationship with Eith, he had to be able to keep his distance. Mariel didn't understand how she could do this if she wanted to spend all her time with Eith. Then Zilk began to explain it to her in more detail. He said that single men of that age usually value and love their personal space and time very much. Therefore, it was very important not to overdo it. This meant that the girl should not demand too much. She just needed to appreciate his free time and space, and when he was ready, he would take the initiative himself. Afterwards, Zilk turned his gaze and thought that Eith was indeed somewhat similar to him. Lonely people did not like being tied down and limited. Zilk added that Eith would get very tired if she imposed herself on him every day, saying things like that he would be at her disposal all day long. In addition, people like them are usually more cool and calm, and they do not like to find themselves in a situation where their partner is overly emotional. Zilk said that if he ever had to get married, he would definitely prefer mutual respect for each other's interests and time in their relationship. There should be harmony inside, and his partner should never give in to unreasonable emotions. No hysterics. A partner who would support him all the time. The girl made the assumption that, in this case, the partner should be like a best friend. Zilk said that it was possible to say that too, and started to sum it up. He said that if a girl tries to put too much pressure on Eith and tries to get closer to him without warning, he will definitely run away from her. Such people have different values than other people. Soon, Eith returned to the boys, holding 2 mugs, as well as a small bag in his other hand. He noticed that the boys were chatting about something and assumed that they had already become friends here. Mariel immediately said that there was nothing like that and Eith had misunderstood everything. The girl was afraid that he might assume that she sympathized with Zilk. Zilk was interested in the package that the guy was holding. Eith said that these were cookies he had bought in town. The guy thought that they would go well with coffee. Zilk smiled and began pouring the hot drink. He said that this was a completely different conversation and that together they would make the picnic very tasty. Soon Zilk poured hot coffee for everyone. Mariel noted that the coffee smelled great, to which Zilk agreed. Eith was already enjoying the drink. Eith couldn't stop admiring the taste of the drink. At one point, after a couple of sips, he shouted that this was really what he wanted to try. The taste of the coffee was excellent. Mariel said that the taste was bitter, but somehow very pleasant, and she liked everything. Zilk also smiled, saying that the coffee really came out as it should. I'd asked if there was more coffee, and Zilk immediately replied that he had plenty with him and the guys could drink as much as they wanted. It really was much tastier with the cookies. Eith held the cup and smiled widely, saying that he was glad to hear that. Mariel was also happy, along with the others. After the cups were empty, Zilk picked up the teapot and began pouring a new drink. He said it was also coffee, but now they would try it from a different instrument. Eith tried it and noted that this one seemed softer and much easier to drink. Mariel added that she agreed, but like the last one, this coffee was also very tasty. Zilk began to pack the beans, twisting the bag. Zilk noted that they understood everything at once, because compared to the last one, this one was lightly roasted and finely ground. Eith said he preferred it stronger, and liked the bitter taste better. Mariel said she preferred the second option. Zilk said his ideal was somewhere in between. Eith chuckled and said that the ideal version should be prepared next. Zilk said that if he emptied his coffee reserve so quickly, they would quickly run out. Eith pointed to one of the coffee grinders and asked the guy to sell him one of the tools. Zilk apologized, saying it was still a prototype and he couldn't sell it until he improved it. Mariel was surprised that such a thing could be improved. Zilk confirmed, saying that they could work on durability, for example. It was necessary to decide what material would be best suited. But Zilk quickly found a compromise and handed Eith a piece of paper. He said that he had written him a good coffee shop where the boy could have a wonderful drink. The boy exclaimed that this would do too. He took the paper and looked at the diagram drawn. The coffee shop was called Rondell, and Eith thanked Zilka. After the picnic and testing were over, Zilk headed to this very coffee shop. He approached the owner, who greeted him, immediately smiling. Zilk put his suitcase on the counter and then put his hand in. He said he wanted to borrow a few seconds from the owner and show him something. Zilk pulled out 2 tools and set them on the table. He said he was trying to build a couple of coffee grinders himself and wanted Rondell to tell him what he thought about it. Rondell picked up one of them, which was tame, and began to examine it. It was clear that the man was very deeply engrossed in studying it, and then he gave his opinion. He noted that this one was much more compact than his sample. Afterwards, he said that he didn't see a handle on the second one, and Zilk said that unlike the first one, there are blades that rotate automatically. An automatic coffee grinder will clearly have an advantage, because you won't have to grind everything manually. This way, you can brew coffee much faster and serve more people. Rondell smiled and said that he couldn't serve a lot of people with his current grinder. Then the owner said that he really liked these things. Rondell pointed to the second grinder, an automatic one, and asked if he could examine it. Zilk indicated with his hand that the lid could be removed and the entire apparatus could be easily disassembled. The man began to disassemble the automatic coffee grinder and said that he expected nothing less from Mr. Zilk. This version was much more complicated than the one Rondell had made. Afterwards, Zilk wanted to hear opinions on his inventions. Rondell grabbed his chin and said that if he couldn't see everything, he couldn't say for sure. He didn't think the metal was quite right for blades. With prolonged use, the coffee beans will begin to give off a metallic taste. Zilk began to write everything down. Zilk wrote down all the comments that the owner of the coffee shop, Rondell, made to him. Afterwards, he began to put his small notebook in his coat and decided to ask something himself. He started talking about the coffee grinder. I immediately thought that it would probably be better not to ask what material Rondell made it from, because it would be ugly. Rondell looked at how the guy hesitantly cut himself off mid-sentence, and he himself said that he made the blades for his coffee grinder from the claws of a silver wolf. Zilk stared at the owner of the coffee shop with surprised eyes. The owner really understood him correctly, and Zilk asked if he would mind sharing his knowledge. Rondell held up the blade in his hands and said that he was very interested in the grinder that Mr. Zilk had made. It was a breakthrough in the coffee industry. Rondell continued to smile and added that if he could help in any way, he would be happy to do so. After all, the owner wanted coffee to become more popular in the capital. Zilk was eternally grateful to Rondell. He looked at him and said that he was extremely grateful to the owner for his openness and attempt to help. Afterwards, Zilk put his hands on the counter and began to press the owner, saying that Rondell had never shared his opinion. Rondell said that he would gladly use such a device. While Rondell and Zilk were engaged in animated conversation, the door to the coffee shop swung open. A man in glasses walked in and approached the counter. It was Mr. Noid again. He saw the new device and asked if they were making coffee with other magical tools these days. Rondell said that this coffee grinder was made by Zilk, a dear customer of his. Mr. Noid turned to the guy and immediately introduced himself, putting his hand on his chest. He said that his name was Mr. Noid and he was very pleased to meet him. Noid, rubbing his hands, said that if the boy did not mind, he would like to know his name. The young man briefly said that his name was Zilk Luren, which caused surprise. Noid pointed at the boy and said, "Is he the eldest son of the Luren family, the famous inventor of magical instruments?" Zilk said that the man was not mistaken. Noid thought Rondell had tried his magic tool today. Zilk said that was not the case, and Rondell was using his coffee grinder and his was standing next to him. Noid turned to Rondell and said that if the owner did not mind, the man would like to try coffee from Mr. Zilk's coffee grinder, and then asked if such a possibility was possible. Rondell hesitated a moment and turned to Mr. Zilk. The owner said that if the boy didn't mind, he could do it. Zilk said that he didn't mind. Afterwards, Zilk modestly said that he could not guarantee that the coffee would be as delicious as the one Rondell makes in his machine. Noid smiled and said it was okay. The man was a coffee fan, so he wasn't afraid to experiment and open himself up to new vooks. Rondell grabbed the machine that Mr. Zilk had brought and began to spread the coffee. He said that in that case, he would make Noid a cup of coffee from the new machine. Rondell started to prepare, and Zilk immediately noticed that the owner of the coffee shop was turning the millstones much slower than Zilk did. It became interesting. Maybe this was the secret of the owner's delicious coffee. Soon, the coffee was ready. Zilk and Noid took a cup each and began to taste it. Zilk said that Rondell's coffee was still tastier than his. The taste was more refined. Rondell explained that the type of coffee bean can vary depending on humidity, temperature, and other factors. Each type has its own brewing technique, which brings out the flavor of the coffee. Rondell smiled again and winked at Zilk. The man said that he had been trained in all of this, but there were still many things he could learn and comprehend. Zilk smiled and raised his cup again. The boy said that even if coffee became more popular, Rondell's customers would not decrease. Noid agreed with a smile, nodding his head. The heroes decided to check how the coffee grinder works. Zilk said that they need to put the same coffee beans in there and then hold down the button and it will work. When Rondell releases the button, the coffee grinder will stop working. Noid looked at the second unit in amazement. It was described as something magical. Rondell was a little worried, but said he understood everything. After adding a handful of freshly roasted coffee beans, Rondell then closed the lid and pressed the button. The coffee grinder began to make noise, and the two men watched the process with interest. Suddenly, the grinder started shaking. Rondell was scared at first and grabbed it tighter, trying to hold it. Noid opened his mouth in surprise, still amazed. After Zilk said it was safe to release the button, Rondell stopped the grinder. He opened the lid, and together they looked inside, where there was already ground coffee. Rondell said it was quite a handy thing, and unlike a hand grinder, the beans were ground very quickly, and therefore came out too fine. Zilk said that, unfortunately, he has not added any settings yet, and he created it in order to speed up cooking. Rondell held out the cup and apologized for grinding it too finely. Zilk said that there was nothing to worry about here. He didn't usually use such a tool and was more accustomed to working with a manual coffee grinder, but he had to get used to this one first. After the coffee had sat for a while, the men were already conducting a real ceremony. They began to catch the notes of the aroma and then began to taste it. Zilk, having taken the first sip, said that in a hand coffee grinder the taste is more intense, and the smell is more aromatic. Here they immediately got regular coffee, and Noid said that at home he would not complain about it. Zilk smiled and said that once you tried the local coffee, you wouldn't want to drink regular coffee all the time. He admitted that he missed the aroma and smell. Noid agreed, saying that the preparation was much more refined. Zilk turned to him, wanting to know his opinion regarding the 2 drinks he had prepared. The hero asked the owner what his impressions were. Rondell didn't even know where to begin. He looked closely at the automatic coffee grinder and said he had an idea about the blades. He didn't like the shape of them. Rondell said that spinning at that speed would generate heat, and the flavor and aroma would be compromised by the heat. The solution to this problem would be to change the shape of the blade. Rondell raised his hand and said that it would be great to have interchangeable blades of different shapes. By the way, the blades could also be adjusted for different varieties. Zilk took out his notebook again and started writing. He said that this was very useful information, and he should have written down the opinion of a professional. Then he remembered Katarina and said that this criticism was what was needed. Noid said that, in any case, these tools were great. Rondell agreed, especially the automatic grinder, because if it could be improved, it would help a lot on high-load days. Rondell added that the hand grinder was also better than his in some ways, as the handle was much easier to turn and could be adjusted to suit your needs. This made it possible to achieve the required taste and aroma, as well as to adapt to different varieties. Noid said that his friend is a terrible coffee connoisseur, and he would like to buy this magical instrument. Zilk turned around and said he could sell the machine if he was happy with the unfinished product, he wouldn't mind. Then he asked about the friend in question. Noid laughed, and then wiped his mustache from the remains of the wonderful drink. He said that this acquaintance was Duke Albert Bland, and he wanted to please this gentleman. The Blends were one of the most influential and powerful noble families in the kingdom. Zilk wasn't particularly interested in their patronage, but he didn't mind his grinders falling into the hands of such a coffee lover. Zilk smiled and held out his business card. The guy told Noid to send his purchase order to his workshop, and they would definitely prepare everything in a short time. The next day, Zilk was already busy refining his coffee grinders and creating the perfect machine. He had already prepared an order for the resources he needed, which was about to arrive. Tristan was watching all this when suddenly the door opened. Rudge came in and shouted that they had an order for the office from some very big shots. It was obvious that the girl was excited. Tristan screamed in surprise and decided to find out right away who they were making the tools for. The guy dreamed of getting rich and screamed so loudly that Zilk also jumped up from his seat, losing his concentration. The girl took out a piece of paper and began to read it. She said that when the guys hear it, they will definitely be surprised by such an important customer. This is their first order for such people. The girl read the customer and then unfolded the sheet of paper and solemnly announced that their client would be Duke Albert Bland himself. Tristan began to clap his hands. Zilk continued to make a coffee grinder, and Tristan cried out that at this rate, even people higher than dukes would be making orders, because a magical instrument in such houses is a kind of advertisement. Rudge said that if they successfully completed the order, their fame would spread. Also, if he liked everything, he could start ordering tools on an industrial scale. Tristan added with glowing eyes that they would now be creating new tools for him and repairing old ones, so his annual income would definitely skyrocket. The guys started dancing and rejoicing in the hope that their workshop would have only a bright future, and in the very near future. Zilk continued to work on the instrument. The boys looked at him and thought that he was surprisingly strange today, as if he was ill. Tristan, however, said that he was not very bothered by all this attention from the nobility. Zilk waited until the guys calmed down a bit and quietly said that he already knew about this order, so he was already working on it and improving the tool. Afterwards, Zilk asked Rudge about the contents of the order. He said that it was supposed to be a coffee grinder, and Rudge immediately confirmed everything, saying that it was the absolute truth. Tristan immediately asked how Zilk knew about this order. The guy answered that it was an order for a coffee grinder, which he initially made for himself, but it caught the attention of his friend. Afterwards, Zilk thought that it would take too long to explain all this. The guys were surprised that the engineer was ready to sell what he had made for himself, and Rudge began to insist. The girl confidently said that this was an order from a very influential aristocrat, so she wanted Zilk to work hard and tell his team about everything without any secrets. Afterwards, Zilk told the boys everything. Tristan was surprised and said that he had never thought that the Duke could be found in such a place. Rudge said that Zilk took advantage of his walk to expand his business. Zilk insisted that he had no intention of expanding anything. He said that he was simply walking around town looking for a place to eat, but the girl didn't seem to believe him. Zilk clenched his fists. Rudge said that the Duke ordered 5 manual coffee grinders and 5 automatic ones. It was a good volume for a first order, and if they could handle it, they would definitely become famous among the nobility. Rudge's eyes lit up, and as she had said, the boys had to make a good impression to get a rich client. Tristan had said that they had to make the best coffee grinders. It was obvious that the guys were very encouraged by the fact that the order came from such an important person. Tristan added that he was ready to provide his assistance and would do everything in his power. Zilk remembered and said that Tristan had told him last week that these were all useless things and that he should make something that was truly profitable. Tristan smiled and said he didn't remember that. He added that everything Zilk made was a masterpiece that brought in profit, and besides, the guy would have made them anyway. So, 2 weeks had passed. Zilk announced triumphantly that everything was now ready. His grinders now looked much larger and seemed industrial for a large flow. The guy took the advice of the coffee shop owner, changed the shape of the blades, and used a different material. He tested the coffee grinders for strength by making Tristan twist it until the handle fell off, and then sent the finished product to the coffee shop owner for testing and received approval. After this crazy work marathon, Tristan looked completely exhausted. Rudge was very happy and said that they did a great job, they tried hard. Zilk was also tired by this time. The guy waved his hand and said that he was going to leave. Rudge immediately grabbed him by the shoulder. Zilk looked at her, waiting for an explanation, and the girl said that it would be better if he, as the creator, gave his goods personally. Zilk turned around and said he didn't understand why he had to do that. The guy added that it was a normal request, whereupon Rudge grabbed his face. The girl smiled, after which she said that she would be extremely straightforward. If Zilk did not go, then as always, he would hang around and waste his time. After which, her face began to change, and she continued, saying that besides how Zilk even came up with the idea of not giving the order to Duke Blend personally. At the very end, the girl was almost screaming, saying that Zilk, instead of his visit, decided to send his assistant, a commoner, to the Duke, and even alone. After such pressure, Zilk gave in and raised his hands. Sweat began to run down his face, and he finally said that he agreed. The guy will go with Rudge to give this order. And so they left their workshop and headed to the rich area where Duke Blend lived. As they approached, they saw a huge, luxurious mansion that sparkled before their eyes. Upon entering the site, they were immediately greeted by the butler, who volunteered to take the boys to the Duke. They took with them a small cart on which they were transporting a box of goods. The butler rushed forward. Zilk turned to the girl and said that apparently this mansion was the rest, and in general the Count's territory was much larger. And then the doors swung open. They were met by the silhouette of a familiar man. Rudge continued to think about Zilk's words when he said that this was not all the territory that Blend owned. At the door, they were immediately met by one of the regulars of Rondell's coffee shop, Mr. Noid. He put his hand to his chest and bowed slightly, greeting Mr. Zilk. The girl looked at him in bewilderment nearby and immediately burst into the conversation, saying that it was nice to meet her. The girl said that she was an employee responsible for sales in the office of Mr. Zilka. The man also introduced himself, saying that his name was Noid and that he worked as a butler for the Blend family. The man was pleased to meet them, and they bowed to each other in return. After everyone finished exchanging pleasantries, Noid asked the boys to follow him. He pointed with his hand to the next large door into the main room. Eventually, the man led the boys into the living room, telling them that they should definitely sit down. Rudge and Zilk settled down on the spacious sofa. Zilk didn't understand what all this was about and why they were wasting his time. The guy said that they had brought custom coffee grinders and weren't going to see the Duke. Noid asked the guys to wait for the Duke here. Mr. Albert wanted to meet Zilk in person, and Noid was going to go and call him if the guests were in no hurry. Zilk turned his head and said that they were actually in a hurry. At that very moment, Rudge swung her hand and hit Zilk on the leg, asking him to sit down and be quiet. After that, Zilk smiled and said that he was just joking. A smile immediately appeared on Rudge's face, and then Zilk added that he himself would like to meet the Duke. Noid bowed again and thanked the boys for this opportunity in their time. He said that in that case he would ask the boys to wait here a little longer and they would come back. After the butler left, Rudge continued to smile for a while. When the clerk had moved away, she immediately turned to Zilk to speak to him. The girl started screaming, saying that Mr. Albert himself wanted to see him, but Zilk refused. The girl said that Zilk had nothing in his stupid head. Zilk said it was just a joke, but Rudge knew him well and didn't believe him. The girl said that Zilk was serious and was about to leave. Zilk, however, fenced himself off from his assistant a little and said that he understood everything. Now the guy wanted her to stop screaming. Noid may have left, but there were still servants who heard them. The girl looked at Zilk in surprise and asked if he was telling the truth. She felt very awkward, and Zilk thought that he was lying just to keep her quiet. Zilk and Rudge continued to sit in the living room and talk. Soon they heard the door open, and the two men the boys had been waiting for entered the room. The man greeted his guests. It was the head of the Bland family, Albert Bland. The guys stood up in response, and Zilk introduced himself, and then added that this was his subordinate, Rudge. The girl tried to be kind all the time and said that it was a great honor for her to meet Mr. Albert. The man took out his pipe and said that he was glad that Zilk was able to invent a tool that would allow him to make coffee at home. Blend would like to see for himself how the magical instrument works. Afterwards, he said that he didn't want to delay this. Rudge nodded approvingly. The girl began to open the package where the coffee grinder lay. While the girl was doing all this, Blend called out to Mr. Luren, wanting to address him. Zilk raised his head and prepared to listen attentively to the aristocrat. Blend said he had heard rumors that Zilk frequented Rondell's coffee shop. Zilk said that was true, and he went there in the morning for breakfast and a cup of coffee. Afterwards, Zilk smiled and added that both the coffee and the food in this establishment were good, so he went there quite often when he did not have a new job. Blend said that he was also a frequent guest at Mr. Rondell's, but recently he had a lot of things to do and did not have enough free time. That is why Zilka coffee grinders would be just right. Zilk said that his invention would hardly make it possible to prepare coffee that would be of better quality than Mr. Rondell's. However, he had some guarantees. Duke Blend was presented with 2 coffee grinders. He immediately assumed that each had its advantages and disadvantages. Zilk began to explain everything. In the end, the Duke realized that if he was going to drink tons of coffee during the day, he would use the automatic one more often. He also added that even Noid cannot brew coffee as delicious as Rondell's. Noid bowed before his master and told him not to worry. The butler said that he would learn from him, and when he could finally catch up with Rondell's skill, he would be able to die without regrets. Blend laughed and told Noid not to talk nonsense. Then he immediately added that sending the butler to train at a coffee shop would be a great idea. Rondell could learn his techniques and become a true master bartender. Zilk said that a bartender is a slightly different profession, and coffee masters are called baristas. At this moment, the Duke listened very attentively to his guest, and when he heard the word used to refer to coffee masters, his eyes immediately lit up. He thought it was very cool. The Duke clenched his fist and said that he really liked it, and now he wants a personal barista who will professionally operate in his home. Zilk smiled and told Blend that it would be a good idea to organize specialized schools for this purpose, where professionals would be trained. Albert Blend exclaimed that he and Mr. Luren were on the same wavelength. Afterwards, Zilk said dryly that they were looking at coffee grinders now, and everything else could be discussed later. The Duke knew he had been daydreaming for a bit, then cleared his throat and sat down in his chair. Bland said he understood the difference between the two, but he wanted to compare the flavors. Rudge took out all the remaining prepared equipment, which included a teapot, tea pairs, and a siphon. The girls said that they thought so they prepared everything. Afterwards, Rudge smiled at Duke Blend and asked him if he wanted to make his own coffee. These words struck the aristocrat Bland. Albert Bland was happy that the boys were giving him such an opportunity. He had to explain everything, and having poured coffee into a hand coffee grinder, the Duke began to grind the beans. Duke Bland was very interested. He continued to spin it, and then turned to Noid and said that whenever he watched Rondell, he always wanted to make the drink himself. The butler remained silent, continuing to watch the pleasure his master was receiving. Albert Bland was a grown man, but now he looked like a small child. After he finished getting acquainted with the manual coffee grinder, he moved on to the automatic one. He was amazed at how convenient it was, since all he had to do was press a button. The Duke looked at the result and said it was very fast. Noid came over and scratched his chin, saying it was noticeably faster than the manual version. Rudge knew the demonstration was going quite well and was happy about it. She smiled and gave a thumbs up to Zilk, who was also pleased with the result. Once everything was ready and the coffee was ground, Rudge helped the Duke a little with the preparation under Zilk's guidance, and they began to taste both different versions. After Albert Blend took his first sip, he raised his head and smiled widely. The man said that he hadn't had coffee for a long time, and that what they had come up with was quite good. Afterwards, the Duke added that in addition to everything else, because he had prepared it himself, Blend felt that the drink had become even tastier, as if he could feel his own efforts in the cup. After the Duke tried the automatic grinder, he turned to Noid and asked why it was better than his. The butler pretended not to hear the question. Zilk knew that none of them could tell him that the Duke had ground the beans incorrectly. Afterwards, Blend turned to the butler and said that he was thinking of buying both at once. This is how the man was going to figure out this technique on his own and understand the advantages and disadvantages of each magical instrument. In addition, he now had the opportunity to drink delicious coffee at home, and this is just wonderful. Afterwards, the man stood up and loudly declared that the guys had done a great job. Rudge bowed to Mr. Blend, expressing her deep gratitude for such words. Zilk stood up and shook the hand of the man, who continued to look at the young genius with admiring eyes. Afterwards, Zilk continued to tell Albert various subtleties and the entire process of creating this coffee equipment, who listened to him attentively. At this time, Noid and Rudge were busy with paperwork and payment. Noid called out to Zink and told him that there was most likely some mistake in the paperwork regarding the price. Noid added that he thought it was too cheap for such an instrument, made by Luren. The Duke turned around, wanting to know more. The man called his butler and asked him to tell him the cost of these magical tools. Noid said that the manual coffee grinder cost 80,000 and the automatic one 300,000. Albert Blend was also surprised by this information. He told Zilk that this price was cheaper than a regular magic lamp. Then he asked Zilk if he was sure that he had not made a mistake with a couple of zeros in the documents. Zilk smiled broadly and explained that he was simply trying to convey the desire of a man who wants to develop a coffee culture in the capital, so Zilk made the price tag accessible to everyone. Noid and Blend were very surprised by this information. They stared at Mr. Luren, their eyes wide open, waiting for him to continue. Afterwards, the Duke began to laugh, and the butler bowed and said that if the inventor insisted, they could not refuse him this. The coffee was drunk, and everyone was satisfied. Zilk and Rudge returned to their lab. The girl was very pleased with how everything went. They continued working, but Zilk said that they could finish for today and go home. Zilk put on his coat and explained that his loyal workers had worked overtime when they were making the coffee grinders, so now it was time to make up for it. The guys had certainly worked as hard as Zink himself, so they deserved a rest. Rudge was very happy. Folding her hands in gratitude, the girl said that this was wonderful, because she had just wanted to go to dinner with her family. Tristan wasn't as happy as his colleague. The guy said he had too much free time because he was alone and didn't have much to do. Zilk folded his arms and said that there was nothing to be done. Luren defended the position of the singles, saying that there was nothing wrong with it. Tristan asked the boss what he did in his free time. Rudge had already run away happily, slamming the door. Zilk smiled and told Tristan that a walk around the capital was a great way to refresh your head, especially at such an evening time. Zilk also added that he also goes to cafes and bars when he is free, and if he is at home, his creative potential awakens and he starts cooking something delicious. Tristan asked about how such activities bring thoughts of loneliness if you do all this completely alone and do not share emotions. Zilk smiled and said that that was the whole point. Afterwards, they all dispersed and Zilk took out his key to close the doors to the laboratory. After Zilk left his lab, he rushed to the market, where there were a lot of people. He was thinking about what to pick up for dinner tonight. Suddenly, the man stopped in front of an aquarium, where there were several different fish, as well as other sea creatures. Suddenly, Zilk told himself that he wanted seafood for dinner. Next, he had a choice about how he could cook the fish. White fish with salt on the grill, fish and teriyaki sauce, or buy all sorts of things and make soup. After the guy looked at the products in this section, he decided that he was not in a hurry and could leisurely walk around the market again in search of the best products. Soon the guy saw that there were people he knew standing in the crowd. It was Eith and Mariella, who were also leisurely examining the various stalls. Since they were adventurers, Zilk initially thought that the guys were selling some resources that they managed to get while hunting. It was obvious that they were having a great time together. Zilk continued to look at the couple and thought that Eith was not like him after all. Most likely, the guy was not a single bachelor, which Zilk was to the very roots. Suddenly, Zilk was brought out of his thoughts by a shout coming from a megaphone. A man was offering people dragon meat to buy. The seller assured them that it was fresh and had just been delivered. Zilk, hearing this, immediately turned around and quickly rushed to the counter with this meat. The dragon was a rare delicacy that was not often seen in the city market. On the counter lay a healthy piece that looked like a neck. The price for 100 grams was 50,000. Usually, such products were delivered directly to the houses of the retinue. Zilk immediately remembered how he had already eaten this meat as a child. This dish was prepared for the boy for his birthday, and all this was served in the form of a rare steak. Zilk thought it was probably the meat from his fingers. It had an absolutely unique taste that could not be compared to anything, because until now he could not get it out of his head. Zilk came closer to the merchant and asked him about the meat. The guy wanted to know what part of the meat it was. The man said it was the tail and began praising the part. The man said that the dragon's tail was constantly moving, so the meat was sinewy, juicy, and tasty. Zilk raised his hand and asked if the tail tasted better than his fingers. The merchant smiled broadly and said that he certainly knew a thing or two about dragon meat, as he often traded it and got feedback. The man said that finger meat was not even good enough to hold a candle to a tail. Zilk pointed at the big piece and said that the merchant had convinced him. The guy intended to buy 600 grams of dragon meat. The people nearby widened their eyes in surprise. The man began to bow to the aristocrat, thanking him for the purchase. For the merchant, such a deal was extremely successful because he made a fortune on it. The merchant took his sharp knife and began to cut a piece of meat for Zilk. He assured the boy that he would like his purchase. Then he said that most likely it was a birthday of one of the boy's family members. The man said that his wife or child would also enjoy such a delicacy. Zilk replied that he was not married. The people nearby began to whisper, seeing how the young man was paying a fortune for this piece. The merchant asked about whose birthday Zilk was buying meat for, but the guy denied everything, explaining that he was buying it for himself to eat in proud solitude. After these words, Zilk began to lower his hand. All the people looked at him as if they were trying to sympathize or did not share such a waste of money. The merchant also felt a little awkward, and Zilk began to look around at everyone, finding out what bad thing he had just said. The seller smiled broadly and began to laugh. The man said that Zilk should do as his heart desires. Then he handed over the meat and thanked him again for the purchase. After the market, Zilk walked around the streets a bit, as he had said earlier, refreshing himself well, and returned to his house. Climbing up the porch, the guy opened the doors and entered. As he walked inside, he was seen in the hall by Katarina, who was also standing with a bag of various purchases. When Zilk came closer, the girl smiled at him and greeted him happily. The girl saw a small bag and assumed that Zilk had also gone shopping. The girl replied that she had been in the store too. She shook the bag slightly and said that she had snatched it all up at a discount. Zilk looked at the products and thought that there was nothing to cook with. After they exchanged a short dialogue, the boys began to climb up the stairs. At that moment, Zilk felt a little tense, remembering that they were also going in the same direction. If they hadn't known each other, Zilk would have simply ignored Katarina and gone home. The guy didn't quite understand how to behave with Katarina. They had a rather strange relationship in general. And besides, the guy had recently received this artifact from her, Soundgarden. He didn't know how she reacted to such an exchange. And Zilk also remembered the story that was written by a certain old man, Selba. It also haunted the guy, and there was some kind of nasty feeling in his head. Zilk didn't listen to it to the end, so he didn't know all the details anyway. But what he heard was enough for him to immediately delete that recording from the artifact. At one point, the Bachelor looked at the girl and thought she was definitely some kind of illegitimate child or something. Katarina turned to Zilk and asked about the meat. She smiled and wanted to know what kind of meat the aristocrat would cook today. Zilk turned around and said it was a dragon. Katarina couldn't believe it. She opened her eyes wide and handed over her bag a little more firmly. She thought that today was Zilk's birthday and asked about it right away, but Zilk's face immediately changed. The guy said that it wasn't. Then he added that before she asked, relatives and friends didn't have birthdays today either. He had enough of these questions at the market. In that case, Katarina didn't understand why Zilk bought such an expensive piece of meat. Zilk smiled and replied that he had just finished work, so he decided to reward himself. Katarina was still amazed at how wasteful Zilk could be at times. She looked at him with surprised eyes, which made Zilk uncomfortable. They continued walking towards their apartments, and Zilk said that it made no difference who preferred to eat what, since they were in a free country, to which the girl agreed. Afterwards, Zilk decided to find out how the girl was doing with her concerts. He was interested in how successful his songs, which he was now passing on to her, were. Katarina said that thanks to Zilk, the new composition has become very popular, and every day all the tickets are sold out. Now even if he wants to come to the concert, it will not be so easy to get a ticket. Zilk laughed slightly and said that there was a small problem with that. Katarina lowered her head, also smiling timidly, and said that there were no other words for it. At some point, when they were already approaching the doors, the girl stopped and rummaged around in her purse a little. She handed the guy a small piece of paper. Katarina said that if Zilk wanted, he could take it. He took the paper from her hands. The guy looked closer and saw that it was a ticket for the front row of that very introduction that had just been talked about. Zilk felt awkward and started to pick up his work suitcase. The bachelor said that the ticket was terribly expensive and he had to pay for it anyway. Katarina stopped him and said that there was no need to worry about it because she got him a ticket for free. The guy thought that now a girl's word in the theater meant something. Zilk smiled and said that in that case he would gladly accept this gift and come. But then Katarina pointed her finger at him and said that she wanted something in return. They had already reached the door and the girl winked at Zilk, telling him that she needed help with the next composition. Zilk smiled in response and said that he would help. It was already dark outside. He pulled out an expensive piece of meat from the dragon's tail and placed it on the table. Zilk began to roll up the sleeves of his shirt and with a smile on his face told himself that he would have a juicy steak for dinner tonight. Zilk had not eaten such food for a long time. Afterwards, he took his sharp knife and began to divide the meat into small steak pieces. Afterwards, the meat needed to be cleaned a little from any films and fat layers. First, the meat needed to come to room temperature before it could be cooked. While the meat was resting, Zilk began to collect various vegetables from around his house and also began to lay them out on the table. For now, it was time to start working on the side dish, and he started with carrots. Asparagus and broccoli were also supposed to be on the side. Next, Zilk took a pepper grinder. The steak was thick, so it needed to be well seasoned on both sides. He used a mixture of 3 peppers. Having prepared the steak, it was now time to deal with the frying pan. The guy put it on the stove and turned on the fire, which gradually began to heat it up. He used a frying pan made of Orking steel, which cost him 20,000 here in the capital. When the pan was hot enough, Zilk grabbed a pair of kitchen tongs and grabbed a piece of meat. After heating a small amount of oil, the guy lowered the steak onto the hot metal. The meat immediately began to sizzle pleasantly. The temperature was ideal, and Zilk began one of the most important stages in cooking, on which the further roasting of the meat depended. He flipped the steak, keeping a small interval of time. It was a perfect piece of meat, and Zilk cooked it evenly on all sides. After that, Zilk moved the piece of meat to another part of the pan. Now he only had to walk a little, and the place where the meat was heated could be used further. The pre-prepared ovozis were sent to the point where the steak had been fried earlier. The vegetables were supposed to be fried in the meat juices with butter and garlic. Gently stirring the vegetables, stirring them with a steel spatula, Zilk began to check the meat, poking it with the device, determining its toughness. It needed to be fried a little more. And finally, the meat was ready. It was time to remove it from the pan and let it rest for a while, allowing the meat juices to spread evenly throughout the piece. And so our delicacy was ready, the dragon meat itself. Now it remained to check whether the merchant had lied when he said that the tail was much tastier than the beast's fingers. All that was left to do for the perfect evening was to choose a drink that would go well with this unique meat dish. Zilk went to his home bar, knowingly taking a couple of wine glasses. Sorting through the bottles, the guy was looking for a red wine that would go well with the steak. Sorting through the bottles, Zilk's face darkened as he realized he had run out of red wine. He hadn't expected that, and he didn't want to go outside anymore since the dish was getting cold. Zilk remembered that he had finished the red wine the day before when he came home from work and decided to take a break. It was excellent, and that evening Zilk had paired it with homemade cheese. After looking around the shelves a little more, Zilk turned back to his dinner and began to think that he really didn't want to buy anything new, so there weren't many options. He needed to go back to the shelves and look at something else. Looking again at his home bar, Zilk wondered what else might suit him today, what would highlight the meat well. Soon he saw one bottle that stood on the shelves with wine. It was not the most delicious, of course, but it could also go well. Besides, the main thing was meat. Then he turned around and noticed that he had a very beautiful glass on his table. Zilk smiled and said that now he had decided everything, because it was not for nothing that he bought it. Turning back, Zilk immediately found what he needed. The aristocrat decided that he would drink luxurious champagne from the neighboring capital, which would brighten up the evening. Zilk opened the bottle and poured himself half a glass. Having laid out the utensils and prepared for the meal, Zilk sat down on a chair, folded both hands, and wished himself a bon appetit. Afterwards, he took a small sip and put one of the pieces of meat on his fork. Zilk immediately bit off a small part of the piece and was truly amazed. Zilk's eyes widened as he couldn't believe how delicious it all was. The merchant hadn't lied, because the tail meat was much tastier. Because the tail is constantly in motion, this part of the meat was very juicy and there was almost no fat. One could say that this is one of the most mobile muscles of the dragon. Taking another sip, Zilk looked at the bubbles playing in his glass and licked his lips. The champagne was also very good, which went well with the meat. Next, of course, it was necessary to try the vegetables, which also had to be not overcooked. Zilk thought that today neither he nor anyone else had a birthday. But with all this, was there any need for a special reason to treat yourself to a wonderful and expensive dinner that you put your heart and soul into? Continuing to enjoy himself, Zilk thought that if he wanted to eat deliciously, then it would be so in his life, and it had been before. The dinner was truly excellent. Raising his glass once again, Zilk said that this was his credo as an aristocratic bachelor. He could feel all the accumulated stress immediately fall off his shoulders. After Zilk had dinner, he packed his things and went to work. He was in a great mood, so he could use his inspiration. When he arrived, Rudge and Tristan were still at work. The guy greeted them and went into his office. Soon, Rudge opened the door. The girl did not go in completely, and holding the door said that Zilka had a visitor. She also added that it was someone from Zilka's family. Zilk couldn't believe it. At such a time, he did not even imagine who could disturb him and for what reason. They had not communicated with anyone from the family for a long time. He immediately remembered his sister, who was always teasing him. Zilk thought that they wanted to invite him to another family dinner, which he did not want. Opening the door, Zilk saw a fair-haired guy with glasses who immediately smiled and waved at him. This meeting was doubly unexpected for the inventor. Rudge was extremely surprised and stood there with her eyes wide open. It was clear from Zilk's face that he was not very happy about the late guest, and the guy continued to smile, waving his hand. After that, Zilk looked silently at the guy who was behind the door for a little while longer and quietly said that this was not his family. Afterwards, the guy slammed the door and told his guest to go back. But the boy opened the doors, trying to stop Zilk. The fair-haired boy said that it was too cruel to his younger brother. Zilk continued to walk away, straightening his tie, when he heard the young man, taking his tongue out of his mouth, call him brother. This immediately provoked the inventor. Zilk turned around and got angry, and then told the young man to shut up. He added that he would kill the guy if he called Zilk that. It was obvious that this amused the blonde. Zilka's younger brother said that it was very strange for Zilka to behave like that, because it was he who introduced him to Ilya, and at the same time began to hate the guy. At the time, Zilk thought it would be a great idea, but later said that in the end he only regretted what he did. Suddenly, something caught their attention. It was Tristan who started shouting, pointing his finger at Zilk. The guy was surprised that Zilk introduced someone to Ilya. It was obvious that he lost his temper. Afterwards, Tristan started shouting that Zilk had never introduced him to anyone. The guy asked to find him someone, preferably an aristocrat. At that moment, Zilk thought about Tristan's words. He thought about what kind of girl, and an aristocrat at that, he could introduce the guy to. Katarina came to mind. But after that, Zilk immediately dismissed this thought and told Tristan that he could not do this. Zilk had no girls to introduce his worker to. Rudge and Zilka's younger brother stood aside and watched their dialogue. Tristan shouted that he found it strange, looking at Zilka, the guy's lack of acquaintances and beautiful girls. Zilk said it wasn't about his looks, but Tristan denied it. He said that with Zilk's position and looks, the guy could hit on 2 or even 3 girls at once. The younger brother thought about it, because from the outside, Zilk really is an attractive, rich, and smart young man, but it was worth taking a look at his inner world. A lot of girls really wanted to meet him. Zilk said that he liked to be alone, and women only interfered with his ability to enjoy a quiet life. Tristan thought it was unfair and then begged Ludwig to introduce him to someone. But the younger brother Zilka said that he was married and therefore did not communicate with other girls. Afterwards, Zilk said that Ludwig had girls from the workshop who were also quite pretty. Tristan pounced on the guy again, not giving up hope. Ludwig explained that all the girls who worked for him had been married for a long time. The new girl had just recently gotten married. Zilk thought that it was a bit early because they were all young. Ludwig stretched, raising his hands to his neck, and said that all these girls know alchemy, so they earn good money. Such girls are always in great demand. Zilk thought that after all in this world, money and your appearance come first, nothing changes. Tristan continued to beg the others, and this time he rushed to Rudge. The girl smiled broadly, waving her hands, and said that all around her were mothers with small children. She apologized to Tristan, who continued to scream. While Tristan was crawling on his knees and asking Rudge to remember at least one of his free girlfriends, Zilk turned to Ludwig and asked why he had come. Zilk first thought that he had come instead of Ilya to drag him out to another family dinner, but Ludwig threw up his hands and said that he was there solely on his own business. Ludwig smiled broadly and winked at his brother. The boy suggested that Zilk go and have a drink at one of the local bars after work. Zilk was much happier with this than with an invitation to dinner. Zilk laughed, saying that Ludwig had told his family that he was leaving under the pretext of visiting his brother, and he himself was going to go for a walk around the bars and have a drink. Ludwig said sarcastically that his brother was a real detective. Then he hugged him and told Zilk to show him some good place. Zilk eventually agreed to take his brother to a bar he had in mind. He swatted his hand away and told him he needed to get ready. Zilk was about to finish his work and said that he could spend some of his time with Ludwig afterward. Rudge continued to soothe the whining Tristan. When the work was finished, the two brothers went out into the street and walked through the night city. The hero said that it had been a long time since he had walked the streets like this late at night without any reason. Zilk asked him if he had ever gone out to eat late at night. Ludwig replied that Ilya was asking him to come home early. Zilk said that it was not cool because he could not just go out for a drink in the evening. Ludwig began to remember moments from his youth when he spent more time with Zilk, and he said that he used to be able to spontaneously go and have a drink. Zilk raised his head a little, looking at the stars, and said that in that case he was even more glad that he was not married and was not constrained in any way in his actions. Zilk explained that when you are alone, you are not bound by any circumstances. If you want to drink, you know that you will go and drink, and no one forbids you to drink even every day. Through it all, Ludwig didn't lose his spirit. He turned around and with a big smile declared that there were also many good things and moments to enjoy in marriage. He gave the example of the time they spend with Ilya, or, for example, the time he spends with his beloved daughter. It was all definitely worth it. They continued walking, and Zilk glanced at his brother, asking him why he ran away then. Ludwig laughed and said that it was obvious, because sometimes you need to rest. Afterwards, Zilk told Ludwig to admit that there were things he couldn't do in marriage. Ludwig started shouting that it was so, but he still didn't regret it. Zilk remained calm and told his brother to stop yelling. They entered the right gateway and went down the stairs to the Ice Rock Bar. Ludwig was initially surprised by such an inconspicuous place with a rather strange name. As they entered, a bell rang on the door, alerting the workers to the presence of guests. Soon, the girl who worked here as a bartender came out. Zilk immediately smiled at her and said hello, taking a place at the bar. He was glad to be back here. Ludwig continued to look at the wonderful interior of the bar, but then noticed that the establishment was empty. This made him feel a little awkward, and then Zilk told his brother to sit down already. At this point, the girl behind the bar handed the guys a couple of wet towels and a glass of water with ice. Ludwig was very pleased that Zilk knew such amazing places. Again, it was strange that it was empty, but it was quite consistent with Zilk's character. The guy smiled broadly and thanked the girl who handed him a wet towel. Zilk began to wipe his hands with it carefully, keeping calm. The aristocrat did all this quite elegantly, but soon noticed how his boyfriend was backing away from the girl, who at that moment turned around, going to get the dishes. Ludwig waved his hand and hit his brother on the shoulder, which Zilk was not happy about. Ludwig asked why his brother hadn't told him about this wonderful place before. Zilk, rubbing his shoulder, wanted to answer at first, but then waved it off and said that he just came here for a drink after a hard day at work. He also added that Ludwig should also enjoy the local alcohol better, because the guys had some pretty rare products. Ludwig picked up the cocktail glass and put his lips to the straw. After he took a small sip, he immediately began to shout indignantly. The guy said it was incredibly delicious, and he had never tasted such a delicious, cooling cocktail. Zilk smiled and said that he knew a thing or two about this. At this time, the girl began to prepare a new portion of drinks for her guests. Ludwig noted that the girl handled magic perfectly. It was truly amazing. The girl thanked him for the praise without losing her concentration. Afterwards, Ludwig introduced himself and asked the girl to tell him her name. Zilk immediately added that he didn't know the girl's name either. Ludwig immediately exclaimed, saying that the guy brought him here and at the same time he didn't know the name of this bartender. The girl smiled modestly and said that her name was Elise. She said that she was very pleased to finally meet her guests. Zilk continued to look thoughtfully. At that moment, Ludwig began to smile and compliment the girl, saying that she had a very beautiful name. Zilk, however, did not like all this very much. Elise turned to Zilk and asked his name. The guy hesitated a bit and then said that he was Zilk Luren. The girl immediately looked at the guy with great surprise. She looked at the guy questioningly and said that he was the same inventor of magical instruments who invented the refrigerator. Zilk said that was true. Come to think of it, this was the first time Zilk had seen emotion on the girl's face. She smiled and said that in that case, Zilka should have been thanked. Zilk smiled and said that there was no point in doing that, because he created the refrigerator primarily for his own comfort. There was a tense silence in the bar. The girl looked at the boys and said that they didn't really look like brothers. Yes, the boys had the same last name, but that was where the similarities ended. Zilk pointed his thumb at Ludwig and said that he was his sister's husband. Zilk would have been amused if they had looked alike, but fortunately for him, they did not. The girl said that now everything became clearer to her. At that moment, Ludwig shouted that Zilk was constantly bullying him. The girl did not expect this and was a little scared. Ludwig continued, saying that he was the eldest son of his family, but at the same time, he did not want to get married. Thus, the guy seemed to shift all the problems to the younger ones in the family. Zilk noted that it was surprising, because the girl was not particularly talkative and usually did not show her emotions, but at the same time she very easily conducts a dialogue with guests. At that moment, the door opened again and a bell rang. A small gust of wind entered the bar, causing the boys to turn around and look at who had joined them. Suddenly, Zilk heard someone calling him, saying that the man recognized the guy. The voice was also familiar to Zilk, and he began to turn more towards the entrance of the bar. It was Eith, who was holding his backpack and sword in his hands. Most likely, the guy had recently returned to the capital from another foray to get materials for the merchants. Eith hurriedly walked towards Zilk and began to greet him joyfully. Eith said that he did not expect such a meeting here, and Zilk said that he would not come here anymore. Ludwig leaned forward a little to move and make room, and then leaned over to Zilk and, not believing his eyes, Zilk said that he, as it turned out, had acquaintances. He quickly got into the conversation and pointed at himself with his thumb and said that his name was Eith and that he was Zilk's friend. Zilk looked at the guy and said that they were not friends. Ada was a little offended and grabbed Zilk's hair, making fun of him. The guy pointed his hand in his direction and said that they drank coffee together, so their souls are now connected. Zilk took a glass of water and said that if so, he would prefer to stop at acquaintances rather than friends. Eith smiled and said that the guy was, as always, dry and cold to people. Zilk got angry and said that everything was just the opposite and that Eith was too familiar with him, although in fact he just likes to eat other people's food. Eith said that it was not his fault if it was very tasty. After they finished talking and turned back to the counter, Zilk heard laughter from somewhere nearby. He looked questioningly at Ludwig. He looked at Zilk and said that it turned out that Zilk had friends, which he always denied. Zilk stood up and grabbed Ludwig by the tie, saying that his brother considered him a complete loser who didn't even have any friends. Eith ordered a gin and tonic. Zilk let go of Ludwig and returned to his seat. Afterwards, the boy folded his arms and turned to Eith, asking him why he was without Mariel today. Eith looked at him strangely, after which Zilk explained that he had seen them together at the central market when he was buying meat for dinner yesterday. Eith hesitated a little. Afterwards, the guy thought that Zilk probably assumed that Mariel was his girlfriend, since he asked like that. Eith immediately corrected him, saying that she was just a comrade from the group. Ida's gin and tonic was ready, and Elise placed it on the counter in front of the guy. Ludwig turned to the guy and said with a smile that he, apparently, spends a lot of time lately with his girlfriend from the shop. Eith also laughed and said that indeed it was so. Zilk said that the boy seemed much calmer today than the last time at the lake. He turned to the inventor and asked what the boy had said to Mariel that day. Zilk asked a counter question, asking what he could have said to her that made Eith want to talk about it. Eith raised his head up, scratched his chin, and said that the girl's attitude had changed a lot since that day, and he thought that the reason was precisely in Zilka. He said that he felt much more comfortable being with her than with other girls. Mariel became calm and natural, which struck Eith from the inside. Zilk grinned and began to raise his glass, bringing it to his lips. Before taking a sip, the guy said that it was very good if everything happened like this. Eith stood up and raised his voice, asking Zilk not to pull the wool over his eyes. Ludwig intervened and said that Zilk had brainwashed some girl again. Zilk, however, remained calm and said that he had simply advised her that day to keep her distance when she was socializing with single men. Afterwards, Zilk smiled a little wider and said that Marielle was a good girl for taking his advice and making it happen. As it turned out, it worked out great. Eith smiled back and scratched the back of his head. He thanked Zilk for what the inventor had done for him. He must have had a knack for women if he could help like that. Ludwig didn't calm down, then adjusted his glasses and shouted that Eith, apparently, had decided to get married now. After all, he had once been in exactly the same situation. After Ludwig said that, Eith raised his glass of gin and tonic and repeated the word marry in a drawn-out voice. Then he said that it didn't sound so bad. At that moment, everyone looked at Zilk in surprise, who coughed, choking on his cocktail. He couldn't believe what he was hearing with his ears. Lowering his glass, he began to look at Eith and thought that he had been a bachelor for so many years, and now he was talking such nonsense. Then he said that things were bad because his new friend had strayed from the right path. Zilk turned nervously to Alazi. Pointing his hand towards her, he said that Ada, apparently, had a headache from the alcohol. The guy asked for some kind of sedative. Elise sighed and turned away. Eith continued to sit happily, and Zilk then realized that of all those in this bar, he was the one who didn't truly understand him. And so some time had passed since the guys had sat and had a drink at the bar. A couple of months had passed, and the weather outside was still wonderful. Zilk, as usual, spent his time at work, thinking up new magical tools. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door and Rudge shouted for the person to come in. Zilk looked up and saw an unexpected guest in his workshop. It was Eith, and Zilk didn't understand why the guy came to his work. Eith wasn't alone. He was standing at the threshold with Mariel, who was smiling modestly behind the guy's back. Eith greeted Rudge happily, noting that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Rudge, opening the door for the boys, smiled back and asked the reason why the boys decided to drop in on them in the workshop. Eith stood there for a bit and then turned his gaze to Zilk. Afterwards, he said that he would very much like to have a little chat with Zilk if the dry fellow would allow him to exchange a few words. Rudge opened the door wider and the boys began to enter. Rudge was very surprised that Eith knew Zilk. Eith knew Zilk. At this time, Tristan, who was working at the machine, also turned and stared at his boss. The situation was suspicious for the workshop workers. Rudge did not understand why Eith needed Zilk, and Tristan thought that the boss, as it turned out, had friends. But you won't hear anything but rudeness from these guys, Zilk thought. Then he turned his gaze back to the papers and told Rudge to let people know that he was not here today. Eith immediately shouted that Zilk was sitting right in front of him and shamelessly saying that he was not there. Rudge and Tristan continued to look at their boss with suspicion. Rudge sighed and said that at this rate, Zilk might even finish joking, since Eith was, in fact, one of the main suppliers of materials for Zilk's shop. Afterwards, Zilk sighed heavily and said that there was nothing to be done about it. He stood up and said that in that case they would chat in the living room. Then he began to see the boys off. Zilk made everyone a cup of coffee, set the table, and sat down in a chair. He started asking the guys about the reason for their visit, and apparently they both wanted to talk to him about something. At this point, after Zilk turned to them, Eith and Mariel quickly exchanged glances and immediately smiled, starting to nod their heads at each other. After which they turned to Zilk, and Ei confidently said that they had decided to have a wedding. This was quite expected for Zilk, because he had already realized in the bar that he had lost a like-minded person. Afterwards, Zilk looked at the floor, and sadness could be seen in his eyes. He said that he congratulated the guys. Mariel was again outraged by the guy's callousness. Zilk smiled and said that he had already guessed that this would happen, because he had seen a couple at the market. Eith smiled, awkwardly scratching the back of his head, and Mariel felt awkward. Zilk folded his arms across his chest, and said that the guys had decided on all this very quickly anyway, and congratulated the guys once again. After that, Eith began to explain. The guy said that they were essentially comrades in arms, as Zilk knows. At the same time, they were clearly closer to each other than ordinary couples, and this explains the speed of the decision. Zilk turned his gaze to Mariel and told her that she didn't know how to get close to Eith. The girl shouted at Zilk not to talk about it now. The guys were adventurers and worked together on such a difficult routine. They are really closer to each other than ordinary couples. Eith changed his smile to a serious tone and told Zilk that they had come to invite the guy to the wedding. At that moment, Zilk closed his eyes and said that he refused. Eith was very surprised, because he still considered Zilk his friend. Mariel began to demand an explanation, and Zilk at that time said that he did not understand at all why the guys needed him. Zilk thought that Eith was not like him at all, because this guy had a lot of friends. They were friends with him, of course, but not so close to invite him to such an event. Marielle was just given advice by Zilk once, and he didn't even think that they were close in any way. They were just acquaintances. Ide confidently said that maybe Zilk thought that the guys weren't that close. Eith himself did not think so. Zilk thought about these words. Eith began to explain, saying that there were few men of that age who remained unmarried. They were similar, so Eith felt a kindred spirit in Zilka. Afterwards, Eith firmly said that there was nothing strange about him wanting to see his soulmate at his wedding. These words made Zilka's thoughts become overloaded. In this world, marriage played an important role because it was believed that creating a family was the greatest happiness. People like Zilk or Eid are something out of the ordinary. Naturally, it was quite difficult for the society, including other friends and family, to understand people like Zilk and Idasi. Therefore, it was difficult to establish communication. It was because of this that when they met such a bachelor, they felt a certain closeness to each other. If you think about it, there really was nothing strange about it. Zilk began to think seriously about this proposal. Eith's argument was very strong and made him think. Eith at this time looked at his friend, hoping for agreement. Afterwards, Eith decided to break the silence himself and continue to persuade Zilk to make a decision. The guy asked the inventor if he really didn't want to go anywhere that much. Zilk said he would think about it because he knew he liked living the bachelor life. So it was hard for him to agree to go to the wedding because it was completely against Zilk's nature. Afterwards, he said that he also felt that someone like him had no right to attend the guy's wedding. After that, Marielle started laughing, covering her mouth. The girl looked at Zilk with a smile on her face and said that he, as it turned out, was much more serious than she thought. Initially, the girl perceived him differently. Zilk asked the girl what she meant by those words. Mariel continued to laugh and said that a normal person would not think about such nonsense. She added that she liked it, because Zilk said everything very sincerely and always did so, continuing to defend his ideals and boundaries. After that, Eith started to get up from the sofa, and Mariel followed him. The guy turned to Zilk and smiled again, wanting to say one last thing. Eith said that no matter what Zilk thought there, they would still like him to celebrate the guy's wedding with them, so he could come. They left the envelope on the table, sealed with wax. The door soon slammed and Zilk was left alone, sitting in his room. He looked at the bundle lying there. He heard the boys say goodbye to Rudge and Tristan and then go outside. The guy grabbed his head and sighed heavily, starting to think about his next decision. After Zilk went back into the workshop hall, he saw his workers standing and rejoicing, talking heatedly about something. Zilk saw an envelope in the girl's hands. Zilk began to descend, and then asked, trying to understand if this was also Eith's invitation. Rudge picked up the envelope and said that they worked together, and if she was invited, she would definitely go. Rudge asked her boss if Zilk would go to the guy's wedding, but the inventor replied that he was not sure about it yet because of a number of reasons. Zilk sat down at his desk and placed the envelope opposite. Rudge came closer and put her hands on her hips. The girl said that she was not surprised, because Zilk, as always, was making a mountain out of a molehill. Zilk asked for an explanation of these words in surprise, and the girl said that they invited Zilk first, doing it just like that and from the bottom of their hearts. With all this, Zilk could have come and just said a few congratulatory words to the guys, and that would have been it. It was a simple formality that would have been very pleasant for the wedding participants. Rudge said that Zilk could make two people happy with this. Tristan added, saying that even if Zilk felt weird, it was still good as the guys were happy together. Zilk folded his arms and said that maybe Rudge and Tristan were right. The main characters of this wedding would be Eith and Mariella anyway. So all this is rather indirectly related to The Bachelor. It was a complete celebration of the boys, and their feelings should be a priority here. Therefore, he should appear there to please the boys, and not to please himself. But there was something that worried the main character. Thoughts that this was wrong did not give Zilk any peace. He believed that by doing so he could go against his principles, and others would think differently of him. Zilk really wanted to congratulate the guys, and understood that it had to be done. Eith would probably be very happy, but then it was unclear how he would behave further if he was already very emotional toward Zilk. The thought that there was no place for him there had not left the aristocrat all this time. From the very first words, when he heard about the wedding, doubts appeared that did not go away. Zilk began to look more and more languid. It felt as if cats were scratching at his soul. Zilk folded his arms and began to think about this difficult decision. Afterwards, Zilk turned his gaze to the table. He immediately remembered that he had forgotten to tell the boys about the coffee grinders that were already ready for them. Zilk carefully packed his gift and began to get ready. Rudge and Tristan were still at work, and Zilk, heavily preoccupied with thoughts of the wedding, decided that he needed to go home and think in silence, where he would be alone. Approaching his home, Zilk opened the door to the lobby and continued walking, looking low at the floor. Then he heard a surprised cry and realized that Katarina was standing in the hall. The girl smiled broadly and said that Zilk was just in time. The girl said that she wanted to record the next composition quickly, so she asked Zilk to walk with her for a while. It was obvious that Zilk was not in the mood, so the guy immediately asked the girl about whether he wanted to postpone the creation of music for another time. Katarina said that he promised to help her. Zilk said that he remembered it perfectly well, but what's the big deal if he doesn't want to now? Then he agreed and added that he needed to drop off his things and they would meet at the coffee shop. The girl adjusted her shopper on her shoulder and happily said that they had agreed in that case. She did not even leave her things at home, and soon Zilk was approaching the meeting place. The girl took a seat by the window and had already ordered a drink for herself. She sat and drank coffee, still trying to understand the subtleties of this drink. However, it was still too bitter. Katarina was having a hard time dealing with this, and quickly looking around, the girl began to quickly add sugar inside and stir it to at least somehow smooth everything out. It's very strange that she ordered coffee, because she probably wanted to impress Zilk. But then she noticed a guy looking at her through the window of the coffee shop. Zilk went inside and took off his outerwear. The guy started to sit down at the table, and Katarina said that it was not normal to look at a girl from the street like that. Zilk smiled and looked at her, said that it was only if he didn't want her to see him. The girl pressed the button and said that they were ready to get down to business. Zilk looked tired, but still kept his cool. He asked the girl what composition she would like to hear and analyze this time. Katarina began to smile and then added shyly, saying that she was ready to consider several options. Then the girl said that she liked songs about love. Zilk looked at her and quietly said that he was ready. Afterwards, the guy started humming the melody. Katarina, resting her head on her hand, began listening intently. Liked this melody very much, and she was too deep in herself. The girl held the pen, but was not at all concentrated on the joint work for which they came here. Zilk's tone gradually changed, beginning to reflect his mood. Katarina realized that something was wrong and began to look at Zilk in surprise, who continued. After the aristocrat noticed that the girl was looking at him in confusion, he immediately began to find out the reason for such a mood. The girl stopped Zilk. Then she pointed her pen at the guy and said that Zilk was acting weird today. She noticed it rather late, but it was still commendable. Katarina said that usually Zilk sings with pleasure, and she felt warmth in his songs. But today the guy was flying in the clouds, and even the rhythm was not right.